The chain snapped tight around Elena's wrists the moment she stumbled, and the guard behind her did not slow down to let her find her footing again. "Move," he said, his voice flat, bored almost, as if dragging a prisoner through a fortress gate was the least interesting part of his morning. Elena caught herself before she fell, her knees scraping against stone that had been worn smooth by centuries of feet crossing it before hers, and forced her legs to keep pace with his. She had one thought circling through her mind, over and over, sharp enough to cut through the fear and the exhaustion of 2 days of hard travel. Her father was still alive because of what she was about to do. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, whatever waited for her beyond the black iron gates rising in front of her, it was already worth it, because her brothers still had a father, and her mother still had a husband, and none of that would be true if Elena had let fear stop her from stepping forward when the debt collectors came for payment 3 days ago. The gates opened without a sound, which somehow frightened her more than if they had groaned or creaked the way old gates were supposed to. Everything about this fortress felt engineered for silence, built by people who understood that silence unsettled visitors far more effectively than noise ever could. Inside, the hall stretched longer than Elena had expected, its ceiling lost somewhere in shadow high above her, its floor a single sheet of black stone, polished so smooth it looked wet. Rows of wolves in dark uniforms lined both sides, and every one of them turned to watch her as she was marched down the center of the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved except to track her with their eyes. Elena kept her chin up, though her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs she was certain the sound alone would give away how frightened she truly was. At the far end, on a seat carved from the same black stone as the floor, sat the man she had crossed 2 territories to reach. He did not stand when she was brought in front of him. He did not lean forward. He simply watched her the way a predator watches something already caught in a trap, patient, unhurried, because there was no longer any need to rush. Cain Draven, the Alpha King. The man her father's territory had spoken of in careful, lowered voices for as long as Elena could remember, as if saying his name too loudly might draw his attention across 200 miles of contested borderland. "This is her," said the guard beside her, a broad, silent man named Owen, who had barely spoken 3 sentences to her during the entire journey north. "Gerald Voss's daughter, Collateral for the border debt." Cain's eyes moved over her once, slow and deliberate, taking in the chains at her wrists, the dust of the road still clinging to her clothes, the tight, controlled set of her jaw that she hoped looked like defiance, and not the barely restrained panic actually running through her. Then his gaze slid away, as though he had already extracted every piece of information he needed and found nothing further worth his attention. "Take her to the lower hall," he said. His voice was low, even, entirely without heat, and somehow that made it worse than if he had shouted. "She works until the debt is repaid, or her father comes to collect her himself. If he attempts anything foolish, she answers for it." The words landed in Elena's chest like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward, until every part of her understood, completely and finally, what she had agreed to. She was not a guest here. She was not even, strictly speaking, a prisoner in the way she had imagined. She was a lever, a tool built for one purpose, to control the decisions of a man 200 miles away, who loved her enough that the threat of her suffering would keep him compliant. She had known that in theory, back at her father's kitchen table, when the decision felt brave and necessary, and almost noble. Hearing it stated so plainly, in front of a hall full of silent strangers, stripped away every comforting illusion she had carried with her on the journey north. "I have a name," she said, before caution could stop the words from leaving her mouth. The hall went, impossibly, even more silent. Owen's hand tightened on her arm, a wordless warning she chose to ignore. She kept her eyes fixed on the king, refusing to let herself look away first, because somewhere between her father's kitchen table and this cold, glittering hall, she had decided that whatever else happened to her here, she would not let fear make her invisible. Cain's gaze returned to her, and this time it did not slide away so quickly. Something shifted behind his eyes, brief and difficult to name. Not anger, something closer to surprise, the particular expression of a man who was not accustomed to being addressed by anyone he had not given permission to speak. "Everyone has a name," he said. "It rarely matters here. It matters to me." A murmur rippled through the watching rows of wolves, silenced almost instantly by a sharp look from an officer standing near the front. Elena's pulse pounded so hard in her ears, she was certain the entire hall could hear it. But she did not look away, and neither did he. "Elena," she said, when he did not ask. "My name is Elena Voss." For a long moment, the king said nothing at all. Then, slowly, he rose from the black stone seat, and the entire hall seemed to straighten with him, a ripple of tension passing through every wolf present, as though his standing had physically changed the pressure in the room. He was taller than she had expected, and he moved the way certain predators move, with an economy of motion that suggested he never wasted energy on anything unnecessary. He crossed the polished floor until he stood close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze. "Elena Voss," he repeated, testing the shape of the name as though weighing it in his hand. "You should understand something before you spend one more night inside these walls. I do not care about your name. I do not care about your comfort. I care about exactly one thing, which is that your father honors the debt he owes this territory. You are here to remind him what is at stake if he does not." "I understand what I'm here for," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You don't need to explain it to me like I'm a child." Something flickered across his face, there and gone, before she could be certain she had seen it at all, almost a smile, though nothing in his expression actually softened. "Take her to the lower hall," he said to Owen, without breaking eye contact with Elena. "She begins work in the kitchens at dawn." Owen's grip closed around her arm again, and this time she let herself be led away, though she allowed herself one glance back before they passed through the far doors. Cain Draven was still standing exactly where he had stopped, watching her go, his face unreadable once more, as if the strange, charged exchange between them had already been filed away and forgotten. The lower hall was nothing like the vast, echoing chamber where she had just been presented. It was long and low, lit by narrow windows set high near the ceiling, lined with rows of cots and thin blankets that had clearly seen years of use. A handful of other prisoners looked up as she entered, their expressions ranging from wary to entirely indifferent. Nobody spoke to her. Owen pointed toward an empty cot near the far wall and left without another word, his boots echoing down the corridor until even that sound faded away. Elena sat down on the thin mattress and finally let herself feel the full weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. 2 days of travel, and fear finally catching up with her body all at once. Her wrists ached where the chains had rubbed them raw, her stomach twisted with a hunger she had been too anxious to notice until this moment. And beneath all of it, a single thought kept surfacing, one she tried and failed to push away every time it returned. She had expected the Alpha King to be a monster, the way everyone in her territory always described him. A man who had crushed 3 rival packs in as many years, who showed no leniency to anyone who crossed him, whose name alone was enough to silence a room. The man she had just stood in front of had been cold, certainly. Controlled, dismissive, exactly as ruthless as every story suggested. But there had been that flicker, that brief pause when she refused to let him dismiss her name as unimportant, and Elena could not stop wondering what exactly she had seen behind his eyes in that instant. It had not looked like cruelty. If anything, it had looked like surprise, the kind of surprise a man feels when something unexpected interrupts a routine he stopped expecting anyone to challenge a very long time ago. She told herself firmly that it did not matter. She was collateral, a guarantee against her father's debt, nothing more than that, and whatever strange flicker had crossed the king's expression was not her concern. She would be wise to forget she had noticed it at all. Sleep did not come easily that first night. Every unfamiliar sound in the lower hall, every shift of a stranger turning on a nearby cot, every distant footstep in the corridor outside, pulled her back from the edge of exhaustion, just as she began to drift toward it. When the bell finally rang before dawn, calling the prisoners to rise for the day's work, Elena had barely slept at all, and she rose from the thin cot with a body that felt heavier than it had the morning before, dragged down by every fear she had not allowed herself to voice aloud. The kitchens, when the guards herded the prisoners toward them, were a world entirely different from the cold, silent grandeur of the great hall. Steam rose in thick clouds from enormous pots, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread, voices calling instructions back and forth across a room, crowded with more activity than Elena had seen since arriving. A stern woman with flour dusted across her apron, intercepted her almost immediately, sizing her up with a single sweeping glance. "New," the woman said, not quite a question. "I'm Marta. You'll do as I say. when I say it, and you won't argue, and we'll get along fine. Understand? Yes, Elena said. Good. Chop those. Marta pointed to a mountain of vegetables waiting near an empty station, and Elena moved toward it without hesitation, grateful, despite everything, for a task that asked nothing of her, except her hands and her attention. She had been working for perhaps an hour, falling into a rhythm that helped quiet the anxious churn of her thoughts, when a young woman slid into the station beside her, picking up a knife of her own, without waiting for an invitation. You're the one who talked back to him, the woman said, not looking up from the onion she had begun peeling. In the hall, word travels fast down here. I didn't talk back, Elena said. I told him my name. The woman laughed, short and surprised. Same thing. Where he's concerned, nobody corrects the king. Nobody. I've been in this fortress 2 years, and I've seen grown wolves go pale just walking past his study door. She glanced sideways, something curious in her expression. I'm Clara, by the way. You'll want at least one friend down here. Elena, she said, allowing herself, for the first time since arriving, something close to a real smile. The morning passed more quickly with Clara beside her, filling the silence with a steady stream of observations about fortress life. Who to avoid, who could be trusted, which guards enforced the rules strictly, and which ones could be talked around, if approached the right way. Elena listened carefully, storing every piece of information away, aware that knowledge might be the only real advantage available to her in a place where she otherwise had none. It was nearly midday when a shadow fell across her cutting board, and she looked up to find a guard standing there, a young woman with sharp, watchful eyes and an expression that suggested she was not entirely comfortable with whatever errand had brought her into the kitchens. You're wanted, the guard said. West study, now. Elena set down her knife slowly, wiping her hands against the apron Marta had given her, aware of Clara's gaze fixed on her with sudden, obvious concern. The guard's expression did not change, though something in her voice tightened. The king. Clara caught Elena's sleeve as she turned to follow the guard. Her voice dropped low enough that only Elena could hear it. Be careful. Whatever he wants. Elena nodded, though she was not entirely certain what careful would look like in a conversation she had no way of preparing for, and followed the guard out of the kitchens and into the wide, echoing corridors of the fortress proper, her heart beginning, once again, to pound. The walk to the west study took her through corridors far grander than anything in the lower hall, past tall windows overlooking the fortress grounds, and old portraits whose painted eyes seemed to track her as she passed beneath them. By the time the guard stopped at a heavy wooden door and gestured for her to enter, Elena's pulse was hammering as hard as it had in the great hall the day before. The study was smaller than she expected, warm with the light of a fire crackling in a wide stone hearth, its walls lined with shelves of old books. Cain Draven stood near one of the windows, his back to the door, and did not turn when she stepped inside. You wanted to see me, Elena said, when the silence had stretched long enough that she could not bear it any longer. I wanted to understand something, he said, still facing the window. You spoke to me yesterday, in a way no one in that hall has spoken to me in a very long time. I want to know why. Elena considered offering some safe, careful explanation, exhaustion, nerves, anything that might sound less dangerous than the truth. But something in the quiet, genuine curiosity of his voice made her choose honesty instead. Because you were talking about me like I wasn't a person, she said. Like I was a piece of paper you were filing away, until my father settled a debt. I've spent my whole life being told to stay quiet, and be grateful for whatever mercy powerful people decide to hand my family. I'm tired of it. If I'm going to be your collateral, I would at least like to be a collateral with a name. Cain turned from the window then, and for the second time since her arrival, Elena found herself searching his expression for something she could not quite name. He studied her for a long moment, arms folded, his face unreadable in the firelight. Most people who pass through this court would rather vanish into the walls than draw my attention, he said finally. You seem determined to do the opposite. I'm not trying to draw your attention, Elena said. I'm trying not to lose myself while I'm here. There's a difference. Something shifted faintly in his jaw, a tension releasing that she almost missed. There is, he agreed, and for a moment, his voice lost some of its coldness entirely. Then, as though catching himself, he straightened and gestured toward the door. You may return to your work. I will send for you again if I have need of you." Elena left the study, with her pulse still racing, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted in that room. Something small and unwanted, and impossible to name. She had arrived at the fortress prepared to survive as a prisoner. She had not prepared herself for the unsettling possibility that the man holding her captive might be far more complicated and far less merciless than every story she had ever heard about him. As she made her way back toward the kitchens, she passed a window overlooking the training grounds, where wolves in dark uniforms moved through drills with careful, controlled precision. Somewhere beyond those walls, her father was waiting for word, praying his daughter would remain safe until he found a way to settle a debt that had haunted their pack for years. Elena pressed her palm briefly against the cool glass and made herself a quiet promise. She would survive this. She would protect her family, and she would not let the Alpha King, however unexpectedly thoughtful he had just seemed, ever see her as anything less than equal to whatever test he set in front of her. Behind her, unseen, Cain Draven remained in the west study long after she had gone, staring at the door she had walked through, disturbed by a feeling he had not permitted himself to feel in years. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself she was simply collateral, a temporary presence within his walls, gone the moment her father's debt was settled. He almost believed it. That evening, back in the lower hall, Elena lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, listening to the quiet breathing around her, and turning the day over in her mind, again and again. She thought of the chains, the silence of the great hall, the strange flicker in the king's eyes when she refused to disappear into the crowd the way everyone expected her to. She thought of her father, waiting 200 miles away, and her mother's careful, worried face the morning she left, and her brothers, too young to fully understand why their sister had climbed into a wagon, bound for a fortress everyone in their territory spoke of only in whispers. She did not know, that first night, how quickly the walls of this place would begin to feel less like a prison and more like the beginning of something she had never expected to find. She only knew that she had survived her first full day inside the Draven fortress, that she had spoken her name to a king who ruled by fear and had not been punished for it, and that whatever waited for her in the days ahead, she intended to face it with the same stubborn resolve that had carried her this far already. Sleep found her eventually, uneasy and thin, filled with half-formed dreams of black stone floors and eyes that watched her from across a silent hall, and when the bell rang again before dawn, calling her back to another day inside walls that had already begun, in small and unexpected ways, to feel less foreign than she wanted them to. 200 miles east, in a territory built on a very different kind of foundation, Damian Cross sat alone in a chamber lit by a dozen candles, studying a map of the northern border with the patient, unhurried attention of a man who had spent years learning that patience, more than strength, was what eventually won wars nobody else had the discipline to fight slowly. He was not a large man, not in the way people expected an alpha who commanded fear across 3 territories to be large. He was lean and precise, his movements economical, his voice, when he spoke, carrying the particular calm of someone who had never once needed to raise it to be obeyed. Felix entered without knocking, a privilege earned through years of loyal service, and set a folded report on the table beside the map. "Word from the north," he said. "The Voss girl has been delivered to the Draven fortress as collateral. Nikolai's information proved accurate. The border pack could not meet the debt." "Good," Damian said, without looking up from the map. "And the girl herself? Any use to us beyond the obvious leverage against her father?" "Difficult to say yet," Felix admitted. She spoke back to Draven in front of his own court, apparently, refused to let him treat her as simply a name on a ledger. Something in Damian's expression shifted, a flicker of genuine interest crossing his otherwise composed features. "Interesting. Draven does not usually tolerate defiance, even small defiance, from anyone beneath him. Watch that closely, Felix. A king who makes exceptions is a king who has found a weakness, even if he does not yet recognize it himself. You believe she could become useful." "I believe everything eventually becomes useful, if a man is patient enough to wait and watch for the moment it does," Damian said, finally looking up from the map, his pale eyes calm and utterly without warmth. Draven has spent years building a reputation on the idea that nothing and no one matters to him beyond the strength of his territory. If that is no longer entirely true, I intend to find out exactly how untrue it has become, and exactly what it might cost him." Felix said nothing, though something in his posture suggested he had learned, over years of service to Damien Cross, that his alpha's patience was rarely wrong about where an opponent's weakness would eventually surface. Damien returned his attention to the map, tracing a finger slowly along the contested border territories, each one a struggling pack whose loyalty to Draven could, with the right pressure applied at the right moment, be quietly, patiently unwound. "Continue the trader's work along the border packs," Damien said, slowly, carefully. "I am not interested in a war that costs me more than it gains. I am interested in a territory that crumbles from the inside, one debt, one weakness, one carefully placed piece of information at a time, until Draven wakes one morning to find he has nothing left worth defending." Felix bowed slightly and withdrew, leaving Damien alone once more with his map and his candles, and the particular, dangerous patience that had built his territory into something every neighboring pack feared to challenge directly. He did not yet know the name Elena Voss would come to mean within these plans. He only understood, with the calm certainty of a strategist who trusted his own instincts completely, that he had just been handed a piece on the board whose value he had not yet begun to fully calculate. 3 days, folded into a rhythm, Elena had not expected to find inside a fortress ruled by a man everyone feared. She rose before dawn, worked in the kitchens until her hands ached from chopping and scrubbing and carrying, ate whatever simple meal Marta allowed the prisoners, and slept on the thin cot in the lower hall surrounded by the quiet breathing of strangers, who had, by the second night, stopped feeling quite so strange. Clara remained close throughout those first days, offering a running commentary on fortress life that Elena found herself grateful for, even when the observations veered toward gossip she suspected she should not encourage. It was Clara who explained the strict divisions between the different levels of the fortress staff, the guards who patrolled the outer walls and rarely mixed with those who served inside, the officers who reported directly to the king and carried themselves with a stiff, careful formality that set them apart from everyone else. It was Clara who pointed out, in a lowered voice one morning while they worked side by side at the vegetable station, a tall officer moving briskly through the kitchen on some unexplained errand. "That's Victor," she murmured. "Watch him. He's always somewhere he shouldn't need to be, always listening to conversations that aren't his business. I don't trust him, though I couldn't tell you exactly why." Elena filed the observation away, without fully understanding, in that moment, how important it would eventually become. For now, it was simply one more detail in the growing map of fortress life she was building in her mind, a map she suspected, even then, that she might need someday. On the second morning, an incident nearly derailed the careful peace Elena had begun to find in her new routine. A younger prisoner, a thin boy no older than 14, who had been brought to the fortress from a border territory, even smaller and poorer than Elena's own, was caught slipping an extra portion of bread into his sleeve during the midday meal. The guard who caught him, a broad, humorless man with little patience for mercy, dragged the boy roughly toward the center of the kitchen, announcing loudly that theft, even something as small as bread, would be punished as an example to the rest of the prisoners. Elena felt something protective flare in her chest before she had fully decided to act, and she stepped forward without stopping to consider the risk to herself. "He's hungry," she said, her voice carrying more steadiness than she actually felt. "We're all hungry. If the portions were larger, nobody would need to hide bread in their sleeves." The guard turned toward her, his expression darkening. "This isn't your concern." "It is, if you're about to hurt a child over half a loaf of bread," Elena said, holding his gaze, despite every instinct urging her to look away. "Punish me instead, if you need to punish someone. I'll take his portion for a week if it means he isn't hurt." The kitchen had gone quiet around them, every prisoner and every kitchen worker watching the confrontation unfold with the particular stillness of people who understood exactly how dangerous it was to draw a guard's attention, let alone challenge it. Marta, who had been overseeing the ovens on the far side of the room, moved quickly toward the commotion, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes sharp with calculation. "There's no need for punishment," Marta said, inserting herself smoothly between the guard and the frightened boy. "I'll see that the portions are adjusted. It won't happen again." She glanced at the guard with an expression that suggested she had navigated conflicts like this before, and knew exactly how to diffuse them, without either side losing face. The king would not thank you for creating a disturbance over bread, would he? The guard hesitated, clearly weighing the cost of pressing the matter further, and finally released the boy's arm with a rough shove, muttering something about wasted time, before stalking off toward the far end of the kitchen. Elena exhaled slowly, aware that her hands were trembling, and knelt beside the boy to make certain he was unharmed. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You didn't have to do that." "Nobody should be hurt over bread," Elena said simply, though her heart was still racing from the confrontation. Word of the incident spread through the lower hall by evening, and Elena found herself the subject of a new kind of attention among the other prisoners, no longer simply the woman who had spoken back to the king in the great hall, but someone who was, apparently, willing to put herself at risk to protect people who had no other protection to rely on. She did not think of it as anything remarkable. It simply seemed to her like the only decent thing to do, but she noticed the way conversations quieted slightly when she walked past, the way people who had ignored her during her first days now offered small nods of acknowledgement, and she understood, slowly, that she was building something inside these walls that had nothing to do with the debt that had brought her here. The summons to the West study came again on the fourth day, delivered this time not by the sharp-eyed guard, but by an older man with silver hair and a careful, measured way of speaking, who introduced himself as Edmund, the king's chief advisor. "The king requires your presence within the hour," Edmund said, his tone polite but leaving no room for refusal. "May I ask why?" Elena said, wiping flour from her hands. Edmund's expression remained carefully neutral, though something in his eyes suggested more curiosity about her than his tone let on. "The king does not explain his reasons to me, and I would not presume to explain them to you. I would advise you simply to go, and to be careful with your words. He has not summoned anyone for a private audience in longer than I care to remember, and your name has become something of a topic of discussion among those of us who serve him closely." The observation stayed with her the entire walk to the study, where she found Kane, seated behind a large wooden desk, covered in maps and papers, a fire burning low in the hearth behind him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "You wanted to see me," Elena said finally, echoing the words she had used before, though this time there was less nervousness in her voice, and more simple curiosity about what had prompted this particular summons. "I have been reviewing your father's records," Kane said, gesturing toward the papers spread across the desk. "The original agreement, the terms of the debt, the timeline of payments that were never made. I wanted to ask you something, and I want an honest answer, not the answer you believe I want to hear." Elena stepped further into the room, studying him carefully. "All right. Do you believe your father intends to repay this debt, or do you believe he sent you here as a way of buying time he does not intend to use productively?" The question struck harder than she expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was fair, and because she understood, with sudden clarity, that he was genuinely asking her to help him understand a situation, rather than simply informing her of conclusions he had already reached. "My father is not a dishonest man," she said carefully. "He made a mistake years ago, trusting that goodwill would count for more than it apparently does within this court. But he loves his pack, and he loves me, and he would not have let me come here if he did not intend to find a way to make this right. He has spent every week since the debt came due trying to find resources he does not have." Kane studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You defend him quickly." "He's my father. Of course I defend him." "Loyalty," Kane said, almost to himself, testing the weight of the word. "It is a rarer thing than most people believe." He looked back down at the papers, and for a moment, Elena thought the conversation had reached its end, that she would be dismissed the way she had been the last time. Instead, he gestured toward a chair across from the desk. "Sit. I have more questions." She sat, cautiously, watching him arrange the papers with the same careful precision she suspected he brought to everything he did. "What kind of questions?" "Your father's territory borders the eastern hills, does it not? Close to Crossland." Something in his tone shifted at the mention of that name, a tightness she had not heard before. "It does. We've had trouble with cross scouts crossing into our territory in the past, though nothing serious. My father always said Damian Cross was watching for weakness, waiting for the right moment to press an advantage." Kane's expression darkened slightly, the fire casting shifting shadows across his features. Damian Cross has been circling this territory for over a year, testing borders, testing loyalties, waiting for exactly the kind of weakness a debt like your father's would create. It is possible, Elena, that your father's debt is not merely a matter of unpaid resources. It is possible it represents the first thread in a larger plan to destabilize this entire territory from within. Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. You think my father is somehow involved in something against you? No, Kane said, with an unexpected firmness that felt almost reassuring. I do not believe your father is capable of the kind of deception that would require. But I believe he may be unknowingly caught between forces far larger than himself, and if that is true, you may be more valuable to this court than a simple guarantee of payment. You may be a source of information that could prevent a war neither of our territories wants. I don't know anything about Cross's plans, Elena said. I've never even met the man. I am not asking you to spy, Kane said. I am asking you to think back carefully over the months before the debt came due. Strange visitors, strange conversations, anything that seemed out of place, even slightly, no matter how insignificant it seemed at the time. Elena thought back, forcing herself to move past the fear and confusion of those weeks, and focus instead on details she had barely noticed as they happened. There was a trader, she said slowly. A few months before the debt notice arrived, he came through selling grain, said he had heard our pack was struggling, and offered better prices than usual. My father was suspicious of him, said something about the man asking too many questions about our defenses, but we needed the grain badly enough that he let the man stay a few days. Kane leaned forward slightly, his attention sharpening in a way that made the room feel smaller. Do you remember what he looked like? Anything about him at all? Tall, Elena said, trying to picture the man clearly. Dark hair, a scar along his jaw. He spoke like someone from the east, not from anywhere near our territory. Something shifted in Kane's expression, a recognition he did not immediately explain. That description matches a man who has been seen moving between several border territories over the past year, always asking careful questions, always gone before anyone can properly identify him. If he was in your father's territory before the debt came due, it is possible he was gathering information Cross could use, or worse, deliberately planting the seeds of the very crisis that led to your being here. Elena sat back in her chair, her mind racing through the implications. You think Cross engineered all of this? The debt? Everything? I think it is possible, Kane said. And if it is true, then you are not simply collateral in a financial dispute. You may be the key to understanding a threat that has been building against this territory for far longer than either of us realized until now. He studied her for a moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. I would like you to think carefully over the coming days, about anything else you might remember. Small details. Nothing is too insignificant to matter. And if I help you, Elena said, does that change anything about my situation here? Kane's expression did not soften exactly, but something in it grew more thoughtful, more deliberate. It might. I have not decided yet what that would look like. But I do not forget useful loyalty, Elena Voss, any more than I forget unpaid debts. She left the study that evening carrying far more to think about than she had brought into it, the weight of a possible conspiracy settling uneasily alongside her worry for her family and her confusion about a man who ruled his fortress with such careful, controlled distance, and yet had just spent an hour treating her like an equal partner in solving a problem that could shape the future of two territories. Over the following days, Elena found herself paying closer attention to everything around her, turning over old memories for details she might have missed, watching the fortress's rhythms with new eyes. She noticed things she had not noticed before, the way certain guards seemed to whisper together near the eastern gate when they believed no one was watching, the way Victor always seemed to know things before official announcements were made, the way messages sometimes arrived at odd hours and were carried quickly and quietly toward Edmund's office, rather than through the usual channels used for ordinary business. She mentioned none of it to anyone, not even Clara, uncertain whether her suspicions meant anything at all, or whether she was simply seeing patterns in the ordinary business of a large, busy fortress. But she kept watching, kept remembering, and the habit of careful observation, honed over years of protecting her family from every small danger that came their way, sharpened into something she had never expected to find useful inside these walls. It was Clara, on a quiet evening several days later, who finally offered a piece of the puzzle Elena had not expected. "You're the one who talked back to him," Clara said again that evening, though this time there was no teasing in her voice, only a thoughtful curiosity. "And he's summoned you 3 times now. That's not normal, Elena. Whatever he wants from you, it's more than information about a traitor." "What do you mean?" Elena asked, setting down the mending she had been working on by the dim light near her cot. Clara hesitated, glancing around the quiet hall, as though checking for anyone close enough to overhear. "There's a story," she said finally. Her voice dropped low, "about why he became the way he is. I've been here 2 years, and I've only heard it whispered a handful of times, always by people who've served this court far longer than I have." "Tell me," Elena said, leaning closer. "He was going to be mated once," Clara said. "Years ago, before he became king in truth, rather than just in title. Something happened. Nobody agrees on exactly what, but everyone agrees it changed him completely. Before that, they say he used to laugh. Can you imagine that? The merciless king, laughing." She shook her head slowly. "Whatever happened, he closed himself off after it, built the reputation everyone fears now. I don't know if it's true, but I know that whenever anyone mentions mates or mating in front of him, the entire room goes quiet, waiting to see how he'll react." Elena turned the words over in her mind long after Clara had drifted off to sleep, unable to shake the image of a version of Cain Draven who used to laugh, who had once been something other than the controlled, unreadable figure who studied her like a puzzle he had not yet decided whether to solve. It should not have mattered to her. She reminded herself firmly, staring up at the shadowed ceiling of the lower hall, that whatever pain lived behind the king's careful composure was not her concern, that she had come here to protect her family, and nothing more, and that whatever strange curiosity she felt about him needed to remain exactly that, curiosity, and nothing deeper. She did not entirely succeed in convincing herself. The next summons came a week later, and this time Edmund delivered it personally, his expression carrying a faint trace of something Elena could not quite identify, perhaps concern, perhaps simple professional caution. "The king wishes to walk the training grounds with you this morning," Edmund said, "rather than meet in the study. I would advise discretion. The court notices these things, Elena Voss, whether either of you intends them to be noticed or not." Elena felt her stomach tighten at the warning, uncertain whether it was meant as a kindness or a threat, and followed Edmund through the fortress corridors, toward the grounds where she had once watched wolves drilling from a distant window, never imagining she would find herself walking there beside the king himself. The grounds were quieter than she expected at this hour. Most of the guards finished with their morning exercises, the packed earth still marked with the evidence of drills that had taken place before dawn. Cain waited near the fence line, his hands clasped loosely behind his back, and for a moment, before he noticed her approach, Elena allowed herself to simply watch him, struck by how different he looked in the pale morning light, less like the cold ruler from the great hall, and more like a man carrying a weight he rarely allowed anyone to see. "You walk quietly," he said, without turning, and Elena wondered how he had known she was there at all. "I didn't think I was that loud," she said, coming to stand beside him. "You are not," Cain said. "I simply notice more than most people give me credit for." He glanced sideways at her, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. "Edmund tells me you have been asking questions among the kitchen staff. Careful, discreet questions, but questions nonetheless." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain whether she had overstepped some boundary she had not fully understood. "I wanted to understand this place better. I didn't think it was forbidden to ask questions." "It is not," Cain said. "I simply find it interesting that you approach a fortress full of strangers, most of whom would rather never draw my attention at all, and instead, you gather information the way a strategist would. It is not a quality I expected to find in a beta's daughter from a small border territory. My father always said knowledge was the one resource nobody could take away from you," Elena said. "I suppose I took that lesson more seriously than most." Cain studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful settling behind his eyes. "Your father sounds like a wiser man than the situation with his debt might suggest." "He is," Elena said, a flash of protectiveness rising in her voice. He made one mistake, trusting that an old alliance would mean more than it apparently did. That doesn't erase everything else he's done right. No, Kane agreed quietly. It does not. He resumed walking, and Elena fell into step beside him, the silence between them comfortable rather than uncertain, filled with the kind of quiet neither of them seemed inclined to fill with unnecessary words. You fight, Elena said eventually, glancing toward the practice weapons stacked neatly along the fence. Every morning, before anyone else is awake, Clara mentioned it. It clears my mind, Kane said. There is very little in this world that does not become simpler when reduced to a question of strategy and precision. Even people? He glanced at her sideways, something almost like amusement flickering across his face again. Especially people. Most of them are easier to understand than they believe themselves to be. Am I easy to understand? Elena asked, immediately wondering if the question had been unwise. Kane stopped walking, turning to face her fully, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore in front of his court seemed to slip entirely away. No, he said quietly. You are the first thing in a very long time that I have not been able to reduce to a simple strategy, and I find I do not entirely know what to do with that. The admission hung in the air between them, more honest than anything he had said to her before, and Elena felt her heart quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Maybe that's not something that needs to be solved, she said. Maybe some things are just meant to stay confusing for a while. I am not accustomed to leaving things unsolved, Kane said, though there was less coldness in the words than the sentiment might have suggested on its own. It is not a luxury a king can afford, as a rule. Uncertainty invites weakness, and weakness invites enemies who are always watching for exactly that kind of opening. They continued walking in silence for a while longer, and Elena found herself studying him from the corner of her eye, trying to reconcile the controlled, distant ruler everyone in the fortress feared, with the man beside her now, who had just admitted, in his own careful way, that he was as uncertain about whatever strange connection had grown between them as she was. Their walk was interrupted by the arrival of Owen, moving quickly across the training grounds with an urgency that immediately put Elena on edge. My king, he said, slightly out of breath. There has been an incident at the Eastern Watch Post. Scouts spotted movement near the border, close to cross territory. Officer Victor is already there, assessing the situation. Something in Kane's posture changed instantly. The openness of a moment before, replaced by the sharp, controlled focus of a man responding to a threat. Numbers? Small, from what we can tell. But they were moving with purpose, not simply testing the border the way the usual patrols do. Kane turned to Elena, his expression already shifting back into the careful distance she recognized from the Great Hall, though something in his eyes lingered on her a moment longer than the situation strictly required. I need to attend to this, return to the kitchens, and be careful. If Cross is testing our borders more aggressively, I do not yet know what that means for anyone within these walls, including you. Be careful yourself, Elena said, surprising herself with how much she meant it. Something flickered across his face again, that same brief softness she had glimpsed before, and then he was gone, moving quickly across the grounds with Owen at his side, leaving Elena standing alone amid the quiet aftermath of morning drills, her mind racing through everything she had just learned, and everything she still did not understand about the man who had, against every instinct telling her it was unwise, begun to matter to her far more than Collateral should ever matter to the person holding it. That evening, word spread through the lower hall that the border incident had ended without conflict, the Cross scouts retreating before any confrontation could occur, though the mood among the guards remained tense and watchful in a way it had not been before. Clara found Elena sitting on her cot, staring at nothing in particular, and settled beside her with the particular expression of someone who had news to share, and was debating exactly how carefully to share it. You've been spending a lot of time with the king, Clara said carefully. He's been asking me questions about the traitor who came through before I left home, Elena said, which was true, if incomplete. Clara studied her for a long moment. That's not all it looks like from the outside. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. It's complicated. It's dangerous, Clara said, not unkindly. Whatever it looks like, whatever it is, you should be careful. He's not like other men, Elena. He's the king of this entire territory, and you're collateral for a debt. People who forget the difference between those two things don't usually end up happy. Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that nothing was happening beyond a shared interest in solving a genuine threat to the territory. But even as the words formed in her mind, she knew they were not entirely honest. Something had shifted between her and Cain Draven over these past weeks, something neither of them had intended, and neither of them seemed entirely able to stop. And Clara's warning, however well meant, arrived too late to change the direction her heart had already begun to move. "I know the difference," Elena said quietly. "I just don't know if it matters anymore." Clara's expression softened into something like sympathy, though worry still lingered behind her eyes. "Just be careful," she said again. "Whatever this is, be careful." Elena nodded, though she suspected, even as she did, that careful was no longer a promise she could entirely keep. Long after Clara had settled onto her own cot and the lower hall had gone quiet around her, Elena lay awake, staring at the narrow strip of night sky, visible through the high window above her, and let herself think, honestly, about everything that had happened since the gates of this fortress first closed behind her. She had come here as collateral, a guarantee against a debt that was never hers to begin with, prepared to endure whatever hardship the role demanded in exchange for her family's safety. She had not prepared herself for a king who asked her opinion rather than simply issuing commands, who studied her observations with genuine interest rather than dismissing them, who had stood beside her on a quiet training ground and admitted, in his own careful, guarded way, that she had become something he did not know how to categorize. She thought of the story Clara had shared, the mate he had lost, the laughter he had apparently once been capable of, before whatever tragedy reshaped him into the controlled, distant ruler the entire Northern Territory feared. She wondered what kind of man he might have been if that tragedy had never happened, and she wondered, with a flicker of guilt she did not entirely understand, whether the man she was beginning to know now, careful and guarded and unexpectedly thoughtful, was closer to who he truly was than the reputation that preceded him into every room. It did not matter, she told herself again, more firmly this time. She was collateral. He was a king with a territory to protect and a debt to collect. Whatever strange, quiet moments had passed between them on the training grounds or in the West study were simply the natural result of two people thrown together by circumstance, nothing more significant than that. She almost believed it, drifting finally into an uneasy sleep as the night deepened around her, unaware of how quickly the careful boundaries she was trying to maintain would begin to dissolve entirely in the days ahead. The following morning brought a task from Marta that took Elena away from the kitchens entirely, a request to deliver a basket of fresh bread to the fortress archives, where several officers had been working late into the previous night, preparing reports for an upcoming council. Elena welcomed the errand, curious to see more of the fortress than the narrow path between the kitchens and the lower hall, and made her way through unfamiliar corridors with the basket balanced carefully against her hip. The archives were quieter than she expected, rows of shelves stretching back into shadow, the air thick with the smell of old parchment and ink. She found the officers Marta had described near the far end of the room, hunched over a table covered in maps and correspondence, and set the basket down carefully before turning to leave, not wanting to intrude on whatever careful, hushed conversation they had been having. She had nearly reached the door when a name caught her attention, spoken low enough that she was certain she was not meant to hear it. "Victor says the traitor will make contact again within the month," one of the officers murmured, his voice barely audible. "If Cross wants the information before the council, we need to move quickly." Elena froze, her hand resting against the heavy archive door, every instinct telling her to keep walking, to pretend she had heard nothing at all. But the words replayed themselves in her mind, sharp and unmistakable, and she understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in her chest, that she had just overheard something she was never meant to hear. She forced herself to continue walking, keeping her pace steady, her expression carefully neutral, until she was well clear of the archives and the officers within them. Only then did she allow herself to stop, pressing her back against a cool stone wall in an empty corridor, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Victor, the officer Clara had warned her about from the very first week, the man who always seemed to know things before official announcements were made. She had suspected something was wrong about him for weeks, a quiet unease she had not been able to fully justify. Now she had proof. or something close enough to proof that she could no longer ignore it. She spent the rest of the day turning the overheard conversation over in her mind, uncertain whether to bring it directly to Kane or to gather more information first, aware that accusing an officer of the king's own court based on a single overheard sentence could go badly wrong if she was mistaken about what she had heard. But the more she considered it, the more certain she became that this was exactly the kind of small, seemingly insignificant detail Kane had asked her to bring to him, no matter how uncertain she felt about its meaning. The summons to the West study came that same evening, sooner than she expected, and when she arrived, she found Kane already aware that something had shifted in her demeanor. "You look troubled," he said, before she had even fully entered the room. "I overheard something today," Elena said, choosing honesty over caution. "In the archives, 2 officers, talking about a traitor and someone named Victor, and about giving information to Cross before an upcoming council." Kane's expression sharpened instantly, every trace of the warmth she had glimpsed on the training grounds, replaced by the focused intensity of a ruler confronting a genuine threat. "Tell me exactly what you heard, every word, if you can remember it." Elena repeated the overheard conversation as precisely as she could, watching Kane's face grow more controlled and more dangerous with every detail. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression she had not seen from him before, something colder and more calculating than anything he had shown her during their previous conversations. "Victor has served this court for 6 years, he said finally. "Long enough to be trusted with information that could do real damage if it fell into the wrong hands. If what you overheard is accurate, then I have been harboring exactly the kind of vulnerability I have spent years trying to eliminate." "What will you do?" Elena asked. "Nothing. For now," Kane said, surprising her. "If I move against Victor too quickly, based on a single overheard conversation, I risk exposing that we suspect him before we understand the full extent of what he has done, or who else might be involved. I need to watch him carefully, quietly, until I have proof enough to act without warning Cross that his network within this fortress has been discovered." "That sounds dangerous," Elena said. "Waiting, I mean. What if he does something before you're ready?" "It is dangerous," Kane agreed, "but acting too soon carries its own risks, ones I am not willing to take without more certainty than a single overheard sentence provides." He studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful settling behind his eyes. "You have done well, Elena. Better than several officers who have served this court for years and never noticed what you managed to catch in a single afternoon." The praise settled warmly in her chest, despite the seriousness of the conversation, and she found herself standing a little straighter under his careful attention. "I just happened to be in the right place," she said. "I wasn't trying to spy." "Perhaps not," Kane said, "but you noticed, and you brought it to me, rather than dismissing it as unimportant or keeping it to yourself out of fear. That matters more than you seem to realize." They talked for a while longer, Kane outlining a careful plan to monitor Victor's movements without drawing suspicion, and Elena found herself, once again, drawn into the details of court strategy, in a way that felt less like Collateral being informed of decisions made above her, and more like a genuine partnership between 2 people working toward the same goal. When the conversation finally wound down, neither of them seemed eager to end it, and they lapsed instead into a comfortable silence, the fire crackling softly between them.
"May I ask you something?"
Elena said eventually, emboldened by the ease that had settled over the room. "You may. Clara mentioned once that you used to be different, before whatever happened to change you." She hesitated, watching his expression carefully for any sign that she had overstepped. "You don't have to answer. I just wondered." Something flickered across his face, a familiar careful shuddering that Elena had come to recognize as the sign of a wound he was not ready to fully expose. "There will be a time to discuss that," he said quietly, "but not tonight. Tonight, I would rather focus on the threat in front of us." "That's fair," Elena said gently, though her curiosity remained undiminished. "I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready." Something in his expression softened at the simple reassurance, and for a moment, Elena thought he might say something more. Instead, he rose from his chair and moved toward the window, staring out at the darkened fortress grounds. "You should return to the lower hall before the hour grows too late," he said. "I do not want to give the court more reason to speculate about these meetings than they already have." Elena rose to leave, but paused at the door, looking back at him one more time. For what it's worth, she said, whoever you were before, and whoever you've become since, I think there's more of the first man left in you than you believe. I've seen glimpses of him, on the training grounds, in this study. He's not as gone as you think he is. She left before he could respond, though she thought, just before the door closed behind her, that she saw something shift in his posture, a weight lifting, however briefly, from shoulders that had carried it alone for far too long. The days that followed brought a careful, watchful tension to the fortress that Elena could feel even in the kitchens, though she said nothing of the reason to Clara or anyone else. Kane's investigation into Victor proceeded quietly, Owen and a small handful of trusted officers monitoring the suspicious officers' movements without drawing attention to their scrutiny, while Elena continued her ordinary routine, chopping vegetables and scrubbing pots and listening, always listening, for any additional detail that might prove useful. It was during this tense, watchful period that her relationship with Kane deepened in ways neither of them fully acknowledged aloud, their evening meetings growing longer, the conversations wandering more freely between matters of strategy and matters of nothing important at all. He told her, in careful fragments offered almost reluctantly, about the weight of leadership he had carried since taking the throne young, about the isolation that came with a position where trust had to be earned slowly and carefully, if it was extended at all. She told him about her mother's illness, about the fear that lived permanently in the back of her mind that she might lose her before she recovered, about the particular burden of being the daughter who was always expected to be strong enough to hold everyone else together. One evening, nearly 2 weeks after the overheard conversation in the archives, Kane led her not to the study, but to a smaller room she had not seen before, lined floor to ceiling with books, a space that felt far more personal than any other part of the fortress she had been allowed into. "My mother's library," he said, when she asked. "She loved books more than almost anything else. After she passed, I could not bring myself to change this room, so it has simply remained as it was." Elena moved slowly along the shelves, running her fingers lightly over worn spines, aware of Kane watching her from across the room, with an expression she could not entirely read. "You don't talk about your parents often." "There is not much reason to," Kane said. "My father died when I was young, forced to take the throne before I felt ready for it. My mother followed a few years later, worn down by grief she never fully recovered from. I have been alone in this fortress, in the way that matters most, for a very long time." "You're not alone now," Elena said quietly, and immediately wondered if she had overstepped some boundary neither of them had clearly defined. But Kane did not pull away from the observation. Instead, he crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes, close enough that the careful distance he maintained with everyone else in the fortress seemed to have dissolved entirely. "No," he said softly, "I am not." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them had allowed themselves to name directly, and for a long time neither of them moved, as though speaking or acting might break whatever fragile, unexpected connection had built itself in the quiet space of that library. "This is complicated," Elena said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still Collateral. You're still the king. Nothing about this makes sense." "No," Kane agreed, "it does not. And yet here we are." Their conversation was interrupted, this time, not by an urgent report from Owen, but by the distant sound of the fortress bell ringing in unfamiliar pattern, 3 short tones followed by a pause, repeated twice more before falling silent. Kane's entire posture changed instantly, every trace of softness replaced by sharp, immediate alertness. "That signal means an intruder has been spotted within the outer walls," he said, already moving toward the door. "Stay here, lock the door behind me, and do not open it for anyone but Owen or myself." Elena's heart lurched with fear, though she nodded, understanding the seriousness in his voice. "Be careful." Kane paused at the door just long enough to meet her eyes, something fierce and protective flickering across his expression. "I intend to be. I have far too much reason to survive this now." He was gone before she could respond, the door closing firmly behind him, and Elena moved quickly to lock it as instructed, her pulse pounding as she pressed her ear against the wood, straining to hear any sound from the corridor beyond. The fortress had gone eerily quiet in the aftermath of the alarm, the kind of quiet that felt heavier and more dangerous than any noise could have been. She waited, alone in the quiet library surrounded by the books Kane's mother had once loved, for what felt like hours, though the clock on the mantel told her barely 20 minutes had passed before she heard footsteps approaching the door, careful and controlled, followed by Owen's voice calling softly through the wood. "It's Owen. You're safe to open the door." Elena unlocked it quickly, relief flooding through her at the sight of Owen's familiar, steady presence, though the tension still evident in his posture told her the danger had not entirely passed. "What happened? Is the king safe?" "He's fine," Owen said. "We caught the intruder near the eastern wall, a scout attempting to map our patrol patterns. We believe he was working for Cross, gathering information ahead of whatever move Damien intends to make next." He hesitated, something careful in his expression. "The king asked me to see you safely back to the lower hall. He'll send word once the situation is fully resolved." Elena nodded, though she found herself reluctant to leave without seeing Kane herself, without confirming with her own eyes that he had truly emerged from the confrontation unharmed. Owen seemed to sense her hesitation and offered, with a small, understanding nod, an unexpected reassurance. "He asked specifically that I make certain you understood he was unharmed," Owen said. "I have served this court a long time, and I have never once heard him give an instruction like that for anyone before." The words settled warmly in her chest, despite the lingering fear from the evening's events, and Elena allowed Owen to lead her back toward the lower hall, her mind racing through everything the night had revealed. A scout caught mapping their patrol patterns meant Cross's interest in the fortress had moved beyond simple information gathering into something closer to active preparation for conflict, and the timing, so soon after the overheard conversation about Victor, felt far too coincidental to ignore. Whatever careful, quiet peace she had begun to find within these walls, Elena understood now, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that it existed within a fortress, standing on the edge of a conflict that could reshape everything, for better or for worse, and that she had already become far more entangled in its outcome than she had ever intended to be when she first walked through the gates in chains. Kane found her the following morning, before the Kitchens had even begun their daily work, appearing at the door of the lower hall in a manner so unusual that several of the other prisoners stared openly as he asked, with careful formality, whether Elena might walk with him briefly before her shift began. They walked in silence at first, following a path along the inner wall that Elena had not explored before, the early morning air still carrying a slight chill that made her grateful for the warmth radiating from Kane's presence beside her. "I wanted to see for myself that you were unharmed," Kane said finally, breaking the silence. "Owen assured me you were, but I found I did not fully believe it until I could confirm it myself." "I'm fine," Elena said, touched by the admission despite herself. "A little frightened, but fine. What happened with the scout?" "He has been questioned," Kane said, his expression darkening slightly. "He confirmed what we suspected. Cross has been mapping our defenses for weeks, preparing for something larger than simple border skirmishes. Combined with what you overheard about Victor, I believe we are looking at a coordinated effort to weaken this territory, from both outside and within." "What are you going to do?" Elena asked. "Move carefully," Kane said. "I cannot afford to act rashly, not when the full scope of Cross's plan remains unclear. But I also cannot afford to wait indefinitely while he continues gathering advantages against us." He paused, glancing at her with an expression that carried more vulnerability than she was accustomed to seeing from him in daylight, surrounded by the ordinary business of the fortress waking around them. "I find myself wanting to keep you close through whatever comes next, Elena, in a way that has nothing to do with your father's debt, and everything to do with something I am only beginning to understand myself." Elena felt her breath catch, the honesty of the admission landing somewhere deep in her chest. "I want that too," she said softly. "Whatever this is between us, I don't want to pretend it isn't happening anymore." Something in Kane's expression shifted, a careful hope breaking through the controlled composure he wore, like armor in front of the rest of his court. He reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away if she wished, and took her hand gently in his own, the gesture simple and unhurried, and more intimate than anything either of them had allowed themselves before. "Then let us stop pretending," he said quietly. They stood together for a long moment, the fortress waking slowly around them, guards beginning their morning rounds in the distance, the first sounds of activity drifting from the kitchens where Elena knew Marta would soon be wondering where she had gone. Neither of them moved to separate, content, for just a little while longer, to remain exactly where they were. The moment could not last, of course, and eventually, Elena reluctantly withdrew her hand, aware of the risk they were both taking, simply by being seen together in the open, however innocent the gesture might have appeared to anyone passing by. I should get to the kitchens before Marta sends someone looking for me. Of course, Kane said, though something in his voice suggested reluctance to let her go. I will send word, if there are further developments regarding Victor, or the situation at the border. Elena made her way back toward the kitchens with her thoughts scattered and her heart unsteady, the warmth of his hand still lingering against her skin, and found Clara waiting near the entrance with an expression that suggested she had already heard, through whatever network of whispers moved through the fortress faster than official news ever traveled, about the king walking the inner wall with his collateral prisoner at dawn. You need to be careful, Clara said quietly, pulling Elena aside before they entered the busy kitchen. People are talking, Elena, about the training grounds, about this morning. If word of this reaches the wrong ears, it could put you in more danger than you realize. I know, Elena said. But I can't keep pretending nothing is happening between us just because it's dangerous. I've spent my whole life being careful, being cautious, putting everyone else's safety before anything I might want for myself. For once, I want to choose something because it matters to me, not because it's the safest option available. Clara studied her for a long moment, worry still evident in her expression, but something in her posture softened, as though she recognized the futility of arguing against a decision Elena had clearly already made. Just promise me you'll watch your back, she said finally. Both of you have enemies now, whether you intended to create them or not. I promise, Elena said, though even as she spoke the words, she understood how little control she truly had over what dangers might already be gathering around her, drawn by a connection neither she nor Kane had been able to stop themselves from choosing, despite every reason caution might have offered them to walk away instead. Word of the caught scout spread through the fortress within days, carefully controlled by Edmund to avoid causing wider panic among the staff and prisoners, though the underlying tension remained palpable in every corridor, every hushed conversation among the guards. Kane called a private council of his most trusted officers, Owen and Edmund among them, to discuss the mounting evidence of Cross's intentions, and though Elena was not present for these discussions, Kane made a point of summarizing the key developments for her during their evening meetings, treating her, increasingly, as someone whose insight into the situation mattered as much as any officer's. It was during one of these summaries, nearly 3 weeks after the night of the intruder alarm, that Kane mentioned an upcoming gathering that would change the trajectory of everything that followed. There is a council planned, he said, spreading a formal invitation across the desk between them. A gathering of representatives from every northern territory, called to address the rising tensions along the borders. Cross will send a representative, as will every other pack with a stake in this region's stability. You think this is connected to everything we've uncovered, Elena said. I believe it is an opportunity, Kane said carefully. If Cross's agents believe their network here remains undiscovered, they may grow careless during the gathering, confident enough in their secrecy to reveal something useful. I would like you to attend, Elena, not as collateral, but as someone whose memory of the traitor who visited your father's territory could prove decisive if he happens to be present among the Cross delegation. The weight of the request settled heavily across her shoulders, an understanding that whatever came next would carry her further into the heart of a conflict she had never intended to become part of, and yet, looking at Kane across the desk, at the careful trust evident in his expression as he asked for her help rather than simply commanding her participation, Elena found she could not refuse. I'll do it, she said, whatever it takes to help protect this territory, and my family's, from whatever Cross is planning. Kane's expression carried a quiet gratitude that went deeper than simple relief at her cooperation. Thank you, he said softly. I would not ask this of you if I believed it put you in genuine danger. You will be under my protection the entire time, and Owen will remain close throughout. I trust you, Elena said, and found, saying the words aloud, that she meant them completely, a trust that had grown slowly and carefully over the weeks since chains first bound her wrists in a cold, silent hall, until it had become something she could no longer imagine living without. Preparations for the council consumed the days that followed. Elena fitted for clothing more formal than anything she had worn since leaving home, coached carefully by Edmund on the customs and expectations of a gathering between territories. Say little, Edmund advised her the evening before the council, his tone carrying the particular gravity of a man who understood exactly how much could go wrong in a room full of careful, watchful strangers. Speak only when the king invites you to, and only about what you saw. The other representatives will be watching you closely, trying to determine why the king has brought a human collateral into a room meant for pack leadership. Give them nothing to use against him. I understand, Elena said, though the weight of the responsibility sat heavier on her than she let herself show. It was on the way back from her final fitting, moving through a quiet corridor near the archives where she had first overheard the troubling conversation weeks earlier, that Elena found herself face to face with Victor for the first time since that overheard exchange, and something in his expression, a careful, assessing coldness she had not noticed before, sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the corridor. You've become quite important, it seems, Victor said, his voice smooth and unhurried, though something beneath the polite surface carried an edge Elena did not like. Collateral 1 month, honored guest of the council the next. The king does not usually extend such trust so quickly. I don't know what you mean, Elena said carefully, keeping her expression neutral despite the wariness coiling tight in her chest. Of course you don't, Victor said, something almost like amusement flickering across his face. Be careful, Elena Voss. Trust is a fragile thing in this fortress, and it has a way of costing more than people expect when it finally breaks. He inclined his head slightly, the gesture polite on its surface and unmistakably threatening beneath it, and continued past her down the corridor before she could formulate a response. Elena stood frozen for a long moment after he had gone, her heart pounding, uncertain whether the exchange had been a simple, unpleasant coincidence or something far more deliberate, a warning, delivered by a man who suspected, perhaps, that his secrets were closer to discovery than he wanted to believe. She considered reporting the encounter to Kane immediately, but something made her hesitate, a careful instinct that told her revealing too much awareness of Victor's suspicion might accelerate whatever plan he and his associates within Cross's network were building. She mentioned it instead to Owen the following morning, trusting his steady, careful judgment over her own uncertain instincts, and watched his expression sharpen with concern as she described the encounter in careful detail. You did the right thing telling me, Owen said. I'll make certain the king knows, and I'll make certain you're never left alone in a corridor with Victor again, not until this situation is resolved one way or another. The reassurance helped ease some of the anxiety that had settled into her chest since the encounter, though it did little to fully quiet the unease that lingered as the council date approached. She found herself watching every shadow more carefully in the days that followed, listening more closely to every conversation, aware that whatever careful peace she had found within the fortress walls existed now within a web of danger that had grown far more complicated and far more personal than she had ever anticipated when she first accepted her role as collateral against her father's debt. On the evening before the council, Kane summoned her one final time, not to discuss strategy or borders, but simply, it seemed, because he wanted to see her, before the demands of the following day pulled them both into roles that would allow little room for the careful, private honesty they had built together over these past weeks. Are you frightened? He asked, studying her carefully across the quiet study. A little, Elena admitted. A room full of alphas and betas from every northern territory, watching my every word. It's not exactly a comfortable prospect. You will do well, Kane said, with a certainty that steadied something anxious in her chest. You have a clearer mind under pressure than most officers who have served this court for years. I have seen it myself, more than once. I'm glad you believe that, Elena said, managing a small, genuine smile despite the nervousness still coiled beneath it. I wish I felt as confident as you make it sound. Kane crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, and reached up to gently tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture careful and unhurried. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said quietly, know that I will be close, and that nothing that happens in that hall will change what has grown between us these past weeks. Nothing? Elena asked softly, searching his expression. "Nothing," Kane confirmed, and the certainty in his voice settled something warm and steady deep in her chest, a foundation she carried with her, long after she left the study that evening, into a night of restless, anxious sleep that gave way, far too quickly, to the dawn of the council itself. The council was held in a grand hall Elena had not yet seen, larger even than the one where she had first been presented to Kane, filled slowly with representatives from territories she had only ever heard named in passing conversations back home. She sat near the back, exactly as Edmund had instructed, watching the room fill with wolves and humans alike, each carrying themselves with the particular wariness of people accustomed to negotiating from positions of careful, guarded strength. Kane took his place at the head of the gathering, his posture radiating the same controlled authority she had witnessed in the great hall on her very first day, though she found herself noticing, now, the small signs of tension beneath his composed exterior that she would never have recognized before these past weeks together. A slight tightness at the corner of his jaw, a stillness in his hands that suggested careful, deliberate control rather than natural calm. When the cross representative arrived, a sharp-featured man who introduced himself as Felix, serving as Damien Cross's second, Elena felt her stomach tighten with a nervousness she worked hard to keep from showing on her face. He moved through the room with an easy confidence that did not match the tension rippling through several of the other representatives at his arrival, and when his gaze passed briefly over Elena, seated quietly near the back, she felt a chill she could not entirely explain, as though he had already catalogued her presence and filed it away for future use. A beta from a mountain territory to the west rose first, describing a series of resource disputes that had strained relations with a neighboring pack for nearly a year, disputes he suspected, without direct proof, had been quietly encouraged by outside interference. Kane listened with careful attention, asking precise questions about timing and specific incidents, and Elena noticed, watching from her seat near the back, how closely the pattern he described echoed the careful, patient strategy Kane suspected Damien Cross of employing along the eastern border. These disputes did not exist 3 years ago, the Western Beta said, his voice carrying genuine frustration. Something has shifted. Trust, that took generations to build, has eroded within a matter of seasons, and none of us can say precisely why. Perhaps because someone has been working deliberately to erode it, Kane said, his voice carrying clearly across the hall, careful enough not to name Cross directly without further proof, but pointed enough that several representatives exchanged uneasy glances. I would ask every territory represented here today to consider whether recent disputes, however small or personal they may have seemed at the time, might share a common thread none of us have yet fully traced. The suggestion prompted a ripple of murmured conversation throughout the hall, several representatives beginning quiet discussions with those seated nearest them, comparing notes on incidents that had once seemed isolated and unconnected. Elena watched Felix throughout this exchange, noting the careful stillness with which he received Kane's pointed observation, betraying nothing through his expression, though something in the tension of his shoulders suggested the words had landed closer to their intended target than his composure allowed him to show. A younger alpha, from a southern territory, one of the few present who had not yet spoken, raised a hand cautiously. Are you suggesting a coordinated effort against multiple territories, my king? That is a serious accusation to raise before a gathering such as this. I am suggesting nothing without proof, Kane said carefully. I am asking every territory represented here to remain vigilant and to share information more freely between us than perhaps we have grown accustomed to sharing. Isolation makes every one of us more vulnerable. Cooperation and honesty about the difficulties each of us faces makes all of us stronger. The observation seemed to land well among the gathered representatives, several nodding slowly in agreement, and Elena found herself admiring, not for the first time, the careful way Kane navigated a room full of wary, independent leaders, building trust and cooperation without ever revealing more than he intended to reveal, guiding the conversation exactly where he needed it to go, without appearing to force it there at all. The council proceeded through hours of careful, formal discussion, territories raising concerns about border incidents, resource disputes, and the general climate of unease that had settled over the north in recent months. Elena listened carefully, watching every face that entered the room, searching for the scarred jaw and dark hair of the traitor who had visited her family's territory months before, her attention sharpening every time the doors opened to admit a late arrival. She had almost given up hope of seeing him when a man slipped quietly into the hall during a lull in the discussion, taking a seat near the cross delegation with the careful, unassuming movements of someone accustomed to going unnoticed. Elena felt recognition strike her like a physical blow. The scar along his jaw was unmistakable, even from across the room, and the way he moved, quick and watchful, matched exactly the memory she had carried since that strange, unsettling visit to her family's territory, months earlier. She caught Kane's eye across the room, the smallest nod confirming what he needed to know, and watched something shift behind his controlled expression, a confirmation of suspicions that had clearly been building for weeks, finally solidifying into certainty. The council continued around them, unaware of the silent exchange that had just taken place, but Elena understood, with sudden clarity, that the pieces of a much larger and more dangerous puzzle had just clicked into place. The remainder of the council passed in a blur of careful diplomatic language, promises of continued dialogue between territories, and formal expressions of shared commitment to regional stability that Elena suspected, watching Felix's carefully neutral expression, meant considerably less than the words themselves suggested. When the gathering finally dispersed, representatives filing out in small, cautious groups, Elena remained seated until Owen appeared at her side, gesturing for her to follow him toward a private chamber where Kane waited, with Edmund already deep in discussion. "His name is Nikolai," Edmund explained as soon as Elena entered, laying out a set of notes he had clearly been compiling for some time. A known associate of Damien Cross, though never officially tied to any of his territory's business. He has been seen moving through at least 4 border territories over the past year, always asking careful questions, always gone before anyone thinks to investigate him properly. "If he was in Elena's father's territory before the debt notice arrived," Kane said, his voice carrying the controlled intensity Elena had come to recognize whenever he was working through a genuine threat, "then it is reasonable to believe Cross has been deliberately identifying vulnerable border pacts and manufacturing situations that would weaken this territory's alliances from within, one struggling family at a time." "You think he wants to isolate the smaller packs from Draven protection," Owen said. "Make them easier targets once he's ready to move against them directly." "I think it is more than possible," Kane said. "And if that is true, then every border pack currently struggling with unpaid debts or resource shortages may be at greater risk than any of us realized until tonight." He turned to Elena, his expression softening slightly, even amid the seriousness of the discussion. "Your information may have just given us the warning we needed before Cross could act on whatever plan he has been building." "What happens now?" Elena asked. "Now we move carefully," Kane said. "I will send additional protection to every border territory Nikolai is known to have visited, including your father's. And we will continue watching Victor, more closely than before, to determine exactly how deep his involvement runs." He paused, something grim settling into his expression. Felix's presence at that council tonight was not simply diplomatic formality. He came to observe, and I suspect he left with information he did not have before, whether about our defenses or about you. The observation sent a fresh wave of unease through Elena, though she forced herself to remain steady, unwilling to let fear overshadow the genuine progress the evening had represented. "Then we keep working," she said, "whatever it takes to stay ahead of him." Kane's expression carried a quiet pride that warmed her, despite the tension still hanging heavy in the room. "Whatever it takes," he agreed. The weeks that followed the council brought a new urgency to fortress life. Messages sent to border packs warning them to strengthen their defenses. Careful and quiet investigations into which officers within the fortress might have been feeding information to Cross's network beyond Victor alone. Elena found herself drawn more deeply into the court's affairs than she ever expected a collateral prisoner to be, trusted with details that Edmund admitted, somewhat reluctantly, few outside the king's closest advisors were typically given access to. Late one evening, as she made her way back from another strategy session in the West Study, Elena passed the archives where she had first overheard the troubling conversation about Victor and Cross, and found herself pausing at the door, unable to shake the feeling that the answers to everything still gathering around this fortress lay somewhere within those quiet, shadowed shelves, waiting for someone patient enough to find them. She did not yet know how right that instinct would prove to be, or how quickly the careful, fragile peace she and Kane had built together would be tested by everything still coming for them both. gathering in the shadows of a conflict that had already claimed more than either of them yet understood. In the weeks since Elena's departure, life in the small border territory she had left behind had settled into a careful, watchful rhythm of its own, one shaped as much by hope as by fear. Gerald Voss rose each morning before dawn, as he always had, but where he had once spent those early hours managing ordinary pack business, grain stores and boundary disputes, and the small disagreements that arose naturally among any group of families living close together, he now spent them scanning the horizon for riders, for any sign of news from the north that might tell him his daughter remained safe. His wife Marion had grown stronger through the autumn, her health improving steadily enough that she had begun, once again, teaching the younger pack children their letters in the afternoons, a task she had been forced to abandon during the worst of her illness the previous winter. She never spoke of Elena without a careful brightness in her voice, a deliberate cheerfulness Gerald recognized as its own kind of strength, the same quiet determination that had carried their daughter through every hardship the family had faced together over the years. Elena's younger brothers, Tobias and Colin, had taken to standing watch along the territory's northern approach some evenings, an unofficial duty they had assigned themselves without asking permission, driven by a fierce, protective loyalty to a sister they missed more than either of them fully knew how to express. It was Tobias, the elder of the two at just past 15, who first spotted the additional Draven guards arriving to strengthen the territory's border defenses, exactly as the king's letter had promised, and who ran back to the house breathless with the news. "They're here," he said, bursting through the door with an excitement that briefly overwhelmed the careful worry that had become their household's constant companion. Draven soldiers, at the northern boundary, a dozen of them, maybe more. Gerald followed his son back out to the boundary himself, and found the guards exactly as described, a disciplined company already beginning to establish a watch post that had not existed before, their captain presenting Gerald with a formal notice bearing the Draven seal, confirming that additional protection had been authorized by direct order of the king himself, in recognition of services rendered to the territory by Elena Voss. Gerald read the notice twice, the same careful disbelief he had felt reading the king's letter weeks earlier, returning now with fresh force. Whatever his daughter had become within those fortress walls, whatever role she had taken on beyond simple collateral, it was clearly significant enough that the most powerful ruler in the northern territories had chosen to personally guarantee the safety of a small, struggling border pack that would once have meant nothing to a court so far removed from its daily struggles. "She's doing something important up there," Gerald said quietly to Marion that evening, the notice still held carefully in his hands. "More important than we understood when we sent her." "She always did more than we gave her credit for," Marion said, a soft, proud smile touching her tired features. Even as a girl, she never let fear stop her from doing what needed to be done. Word of the council reached Gerald Voss within days, carried by a traveling messenger who moved between the smaller border packs collecting news that rarely arrived through official channels. He sat in his own kitchen that evening, the same worn table where he had once told his daughter about the debt that would take her away from home, and felt a fear settle into him that he had not expected to feel again so soon. If Damian Cross was testing the Draven borders more aggressively, gathering information through agents planted across the northern territories, it meant the fragile peace holding the region together for years was beginning to crack, and it meant his daughter, however unwillingly, now stood closer to the center of that danger than he had ever intended when he agreed to send her north as collateral. He wrote a letter that night, careful and formal, addressed to the Alpha King himself, offering what little he could toward the debt and pleading, in language he hoped would not sound as desperate as it felt, for information about his daughter's safety. He did not expect a response. Kings, in his experience, rarely answered the letters of struggling betas, no matter how urgently they were written. He was wrong. The response arrived within the week, carried by an official courier rather than the usual traveling messenger, sealed with the Draven crest, and written in a hand too precise to belong to anyone but the king himself. Gerald read it twice before he allowed himself to believe what it said. "Your daughter is safe and in good health. She has proven more valuable to this court than the terms of the original debt required, and her continued presence here, for now, serves purposes beyond simple collateral. I would ask that you remain alert to any unusual activity along your borders, and report it directly to this court. The threat we both face may be larger than either of us understood when the debt was first incurred." Gerald read the letter a third time, searching for hidden threats or warnings between the careful, formal lines, and found none. What he found instead was something he had not expected from the man everyone called Merciless, a kind of respect, an acknowledgement that his daughter was more than a bargaining chip, and beneath it, though he could not have named exactly why he sensed it, something that felt almost like concern. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his coat, deciding not to mention its full contents to his wife just yet, not until he understood better what it might mean for the family he was still desperately trying to protect. That night, he doubled the watch along their own small territory's border, and began, quietly, gathering what resources he could, toward the debt that had brought this entire situation into motion, driven now by more than simple obligation. He was driven by the growing understanding that his daughter's safety, and the safety of every family like his own, scattered along the contested northern border, depended on a war that had not yet begun being stopped before it could. Back at the fortress, Elena wrote her own letter that same week, describing, in careful terms that avoided revealing anything about the true danger gathering around them, the ordinary rhythms of her days, the friends she had made among the kitchen staff, small details meant to reassure her mother and brothers that she remained safe, and, in her own way, finding purpose within walls that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming. She did not mention Kane directly, uncertain how to explain, even to herself, what had grown between them, and uncertain whether such information, however carefully phrased, might somehow find its way into the wrong hands, and create new dangers for people she loved. Some things, she decided, folding the letter carefully before handing it to the courier assigned to carry messages between the fortress and the border territories, were better carried quietly, until the day came when she could explain them in person, with her family gathered safely around her, rather than scattered across 200 miles of contested land. That evening, as she made her way back toward the lower hall, she found herself passing the training grounds where she had first walked beside Kane in the pale morning light, and she paused, watching the last of the day's light fade slowly across the packed earth, allowing herself, just for a moment, to feel something like hope amid all the uncertainty still gathering around them. Whatever came next, whatever dangers Cross and his network still intended to unleash against this territory, she was no longer facing them alone, and neither, she suspected, was Kane. The break in the investigation came sooner than anyone expected, delivered not through careful surveillance, but through a mistake Victor himself made, grown perhaps overconfident after weeks without any sign that his activities had drawn suspicion. Owen intercepted a message intended for delivery beyond the fortress walls, carried by a young guard who had been paid, it turned out, a modest sum to smuggle correspondence past the usual checkpoints without asking questions about its contents. The message, once decoded by Edmund after several hours of careful, concentrated work, confirmed everything Kane had suspected and more. Victor had been feeding information to Cross's network for well over a year, reporting on troop movements, supply shortages, and the internal politics of the Draven court, in exchange for promises of position within Cross's territory, once the northern packs were reorganized under his control. The message also confirmed that the traitor Nikolai had indeed been sent deliberately to identify vulnerable border packs, including Elena's own, as part of a broader strategy to weaken Draven alliances one struggling territory at a time. Kane called for Victor's arrest that same evening, moving with a swift, controlled efficiency that left no opportunity for the officer to realize his exposure before guards arrived to escort him to a private chamber for questioning. Elena was not present for the confrontation, kept safely in the West Study under Edmund's careful watch, while Kane and Owen dealt with the matter directly, but she waited anxiously, unable to focus on anything beyond the muffled sounds of activity elsewhere in the fortress. When Kane finally returned, hours later, his expression carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had just been forced to confront a betrayal he had not wanted to believe possible, despite every piece of evidence pointing toward it. "He has been removed from his position, and from this territory entirely," Kane said, settling heavily into the chair across from her. "Cross will know his network here has been exposed. Whatever plan he was building against the border packs will likely accelerate, now that his advantage of secrecy is gone." "What does that mean for my father's territory?" Elena asked, unable to keep the worry from her voice. "It means I am sending additional guards to strengthen the border defenses of every territory Nikolai visited," Kane said. Including your father's. I will not allow Cross to punish struggling Pax for a debt his own manipulation may have engineered in the first place. Relief washed through Elena, followed quickly by a gratitude she found herself struggling to express adequately. Thank you, she said, for protecting them. You didn't have to do that. I did, Kane said quietly. Because it is the right thing to do, and because your family's safety matters to me now, in a way I did not anticipate when this began. Word of Victor's removal spread through the fortress within days, carefully managed by Edmund to avoid causing wider panic among the staff, though the underlying unease remained evident in every corridor. Clara found Elena during the evening meal, her expression carrying a mixture of relief and lingering wariness. Everyone's saying he was working for Cross, Clara said quietly, keeping her voice low enough that only Elena could hear. That the king found proof and had him removed before anyone even knew what was happening. It's true, Elena said, unable to keep a note of quiet satisfaction from her voice, despite the seriousness of the situation. He'd been feeding information for over a year. It's over now, at least that part of it. Clara studied her for a long moment, something thoughtful crossing her expression. You knew before everyone else, didn't you? That's what all those meetings with the king have really been about. Elena hesitated, uncertain how much to reveal even to a friend she trusted, but decided, finally, that Clara had earned enough honesty to understand at least part of the truth. I overheard something, weeks ago, and told the king. It's part of why he's been asking me so many questions since I arrived. And the rest? Clara asked, a knowing look in her eyes. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, unable to fully hide the truth from someone who had watched her grow closer to Kane over these past weeks, with the careful attention of a friend, genuinely concerned for her well-being. The rest is complicated, she admitted. But it's not just strategy anymore, Clara. I think it hasn't been just strategy for a while. Clara's expression softened into something warmer than the wariness she had shown before. I still think you should be careful, she said. But I've watched you these past weeks, Elena. Whatever this is, it's changed you. You walk through this fortress like you belong here now, not like a prisoner counting the days until she can leave. The observation struck Elena harder than she expected, and she found herself considering it long after the conversation ended, turning the words over as she lay awake that night in the quiet lower hall. Clara was right, she realized. Somewhere in the weeks since chains first bound her wrists in that cold, silent hall, this fortress had stopped feeling like a prison and had begun, slowly and unexpectedly, to feel like something closer to home. Kane summoned her the following evening, not to the West Study or the library, but to a small rooftop terrace she had not known existed, accessible through a narrow stairway near the fortress's highest tower. The view stretched out across the entire territory, dark hills rolling toward a horizon, just beginning to catch the last colors of sunset, and Elena found herself momentarily speechless at the sight of it. I come here when I need to think clearly, Kane said, joining her at the railing. It reminds me why all of this matters, why the borders and the councils and the careful, constant vigilance are worth the cost they demand. It's beautiful, Elena said softly, unable to look away from the sweeping view before them. Not as beautiful as what I actually wanted to discuss with you tonight, Kane said, and something in his tone made Elena turn to look at him instead of the horizon. What did you want to discuss? Victor's removal has made certain things clearer to me, Kane said carefully. How quickly danger can arrive from directions we do not expect. How little time any of us truly have to waste on hesitation, when hesitation is a luxury only the safe and the certain can afford. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his own, the gesture careful and deliberate. I do not want to hesitate any longer, Elena, about telling you plainly what I feel, even though every instinct built over years of careful control tells me it is unwise to say it aloud. Elena's heart quickened, hope and fear tangling together in her chest as she waited for him to continue. I care for you, Kane said, the words coming slowly, as though each one cost him something significant to release, more deeply than I believed myself capable of caring for anyone again. I do not know what that means for either of us, given everything you are and everything I am, but I did not want to spend one more day pretending it was not true. I care for you too, Elena said, her voice unsteady with emotion. I've cared for you for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself. It terrifies me, how much I've come to feel for a man I was supposed to see only as my captor. You were never my prisoner, Kane said softly. Not truly. Not since that first day, when you refused to let me dismiss your name as unimportant. They stood together at the railing, as the last light faded from the sky, the weight of everything spoken between them settling into something steady and certain, despite the uncertainty of everything still gathering around them. Elena leaned into him slightly, and Kane wrapped an arm carefully around her shoulders, the gesture protective and gentle in equal measure, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, content simply to stand together beneath the darkening sky, two people who had found, against every expectation either of them carried into this fortress, something worth holding on to, amid all the danger still circling closer with every passing week. There is something I have been meaning to tell you, Kane said eventually, breaking the comfortable silence, about my past, about why I built the walls you have spent these past weeks so patiently working to take down. Elena turned to look at him, sensing the weight behind his words, the careful vulnerability of a man preparing to share something he had guarded closely for a very long time. I'm listening, she said gently. Whenever you're ready. Kane was quiet for a long moment, gathering himself, and Elena waited patiently, understanding that whatever he was about to share had shaped him more deeply than anything else in his life, and that the trust required to finally speak it aloud was itself a gift she did not intend to take lightly. Word of Victor's exposure reached Damien Cross within 2 days, delivered by a rider who had ridden hard enough to nearly ruin his horse in the process. Damien received the news in the same quiet chamber where he had first learned of Elena's arrival at the Draven fortress, and though his expression betrayed little of what he felt, Felix, who had served him long enough to read the smaller signs, recognized the tightening at the corner of his alpha's jaw as genuine anger, rare and dangerous when it surfaced. 6 years of careful work, Damien said finally, his voice quiet in the way that had always unsettled those who served him, more than shouting ever could. 6 years. Undone, because Draven's collateral prisoner happened to overhear a careless conversation in an archive. She has proven more valuable to him than we anticipated, Felix said carefully. The reports suggest he consults her directly now, on matters of strategy, not merely as a source of information about her father's territory. Then perhaps our calculation about her value was correct from the beginning, simply aimed in the wrong direction, Damien said, something cold and calculating settling behind his pale eyes. We assumed she would remain a passive lever against her father. Instead, she has become an active threat to the very network we spent years building. He was quiet for a long moment, turning the problem over with the same patient, deliberate attention he brought to every decision. We cannot allow this to stand unanswered. If Draven believes exposing Victor cost us nothing, he will grow bolder, and boldness in an enemy is far more dangerous to us than caution ever was. What would you have us do? Felix asked. Remind him what he stands to lose, Damien said. Not with a full assault, not yet. A demonstration. Strike one of the smaller packs under his protection, quickly and visibly, before he has time to fully strengthen every border in response to Victor's exposure. Let him understand that removing one informant does not remove our reach into his territory. Felix nodded, already turning toward the door to relay the order, but paused at Damien's next words, spoken almost as an afterthought, though nothing Damien Cross said was ever truly incidental. And keep watching the girl, Damien added, closely. If Draven values her enough to grieve Victor's loss because of what she uncovered, then she may yet prove to be the single greatest weakness this campaign has been searching for since it began. The peace of that evening on the rooftop terrace did not last long. Word arrived before dawn the next morning, carried by an exhausted rider who had traveled through the night from a border outpost 2 days' journey east, that Cross forces had launched a sudden, coordinated raid against a smaller pack allied with the Draven territory, burning grain stores and driving off livestock before retreating back across the border, ahead of any organized response. Kane received the news in the West study, Elena present at his side when Owen delivered the grim report, and she watched the careful warmth that had settled over him during the previous evening, harden instantly back into the sharp, controlled focus of a ruler facing open conflict. How many casualties? Kane asked, his voice tight with barely restrained anger. 3 wounded, none killed, though the pack has lost nearly a third of its winter stores, Owen said. It appears deliberate, my king, Not a raid meant to conquer territory, but one meant to punish and to send a message. Victor's exposure, Kane said grimly. Cross knows we uncovered his network, and this is his response. A demonstration that he can still reach us, still hurt the packs under our protection, whether or not his informants remain in place. Elena felt a cold weight settle in her stomach. The abstract danger she had been helping to investigate for weeks, suddenly rendered brutally concrete. Is my father's territory at risk of something similar? I have already sent additional guards there, as promised, Kane said, though his expression offered little comfort given the news they had just received. But I will not pretend the danger has lessened. If anything, Cross's willingness to strike now, so soon after Victor's removal, suggests he is accelerating whatever timeline he originally intended. A war council convened within the hour, filling the great hall with officers and advisors Elena had glimpsed before, only from a careful distance. And though she was not formally part of the gathering, Kane insisted she remain present, seated close enough to hear the full discussion unfold. We cannot simply absorb these strikes indefinitely, argued one of the senior officers, a grizzled wolf named Aldrich who had served the Draven court since Kane's father's reign. Every raid weakens the packs under our protection, and strengthens the perception that this territory cannot defend its allies. If we do not respond decisively, others will begin to question whether alliance with Draven still offers the security it once did. A hasty response is precisely what Cross wants, Kane countered, his voice carrying the weight of careful deliberation even amid the tension filling the hall. If we march against him now, based on a single raid, we risk exactly the kind of costly, extended conflict that would drain resources from every territory involved, resources Cross has spent over a year positioning himself to exploit. Then what would you have us do? Aldrich pressed. Wait for the next raid? The one after that? Elena found herself speaking before she had fully decided to, the words rising from weeks of careful observation and a growing understanding of the strategic patterns Cross had employed throughout this entire campaign. He's testing your restraint, she said, drawing several surprised glances from officers unaccustomed to hearing a collateral prisoner offer strategy in a war council. Every raid, every scout, every piece of information gathered through Victor, it's all been about finding the edge of what will provoke a response. If you give him the large, decisive conflict he seems to be baiting you toward, you play directly into whatever advantage he's spent over a year building. Kane's expression sharpened with interest, gesturing for her to continue. What if, instead, you strengthen every border pack individually, quietly, the way you've already started doing? Elena continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. Make each raid cost him more than it gains, without giving him the large confrontation he wants. Let him exhaust his resources testing a defense that keeps getting stronger every time he tests it, rather than handing him the war he's been preparing for. Silence settled over the hall for a long moment, officers exchanging glances that ranged from skeptical to thoughtful, until Aldrich, surprisingly, was the first to break it. It is not without merit, the older officer admitted grudgingly, a patient defense rather than a hasty offense. It would require discipline, and time we may not have in abundance, but it denies him the very confrontation his entire strategy appears built around. Kane's gaze moved to Elena, something proud and unmistakably warm, flickering behind the careful authority he maintained in front of his officers. We will pursue exactly that approach, he said, his voice carrying clear finality. Strengthen every border defense, respond to each raid with measured, proportional resistance rather than escalation, and continue gathering intelligence on Cross's remaining network within our walls. We deny him the war he wants until we are positioned to end this conflict entirely on our own terms. The council dispersed gradually, officers departing to begin implementing the strategy Kane had outlined, and Elena found herself lingering near the back of the emptying hall, uncertain and slightly overwhelmed by how directly her voice had just shaped the direction of an entire territory's defense. Kane approached her once the last of the officers had gone, something admiring in his expression that she had not seen from him quite so openly before, even in their most private moments. You just changed the course of this conflict, he said quietly. Aldrich has served this court for 30 years, and I have rarely seen him agree so quickly with a strategy he did not propose himself. I just said what seemed obvious to me, Elena said, still slightly unsteady from the weight of the moment. I don't know if it was the right call. It was, Kane said firmly. You understand Cross's patterns better than officers who have studied him for years. because you have lived the consequences of his manipulation directly, rather than simply reading about them in reports. That perspective is more valuable than you seem to realize. The praise settled warmly in her chest, despite the underlying gravity of the situation, and Elena allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel something like pride amid all the fear and uncertainty still surrounding them. Whatever came next in this conflict, she understood now, with a clarity that had been building steadily since that first overheard conversation in the archives, that she was no longer simply collateral waiting to be exchanged for her father's debt. She had become something else entirely within these walls, a voice that mattered, a mind that Kane trusted enough to shape the strategy of an entire territory's defense, and the realization carried a weight she had never expected to feel, heavy and humbling and, despite everything, deeply satisfying. 2 nights before that conversation, an incident occurred that neither Elena nor Kane spoke of publicly, though it sharpened, considerably, the urgency Kane already felt about protecting her. A guard making rounds near the lower hall noticed a section of fencing along the fortress's outer perimeter, disturbed in a manner too deliberate to be accidental, wood pried carefully away, in a spot rarely patrolled during the deepest hours of the night. When Owen investigated further, he found fresh tracks leading toward, and then away from, the very corridor connecting the lower hall to the kitchens, the exact path Elena walked every morning on her way to begin her work. Someone was scouting a route, Owen reported to Kane grimly, laying a rough sketch of the disturbed fencing across the desk in the west study. Whether they intended to act that same night, or were simply gathering information for later, I cannot say with certainty, but it was deliberate, and it was focused on a path Elena uses daily. Kane's expression had gone cold, and still, in a way Elena recognized now as the particular stillness that preceded his most decisive actions. "Move her quarters," he said immediately. "Tonight. Somewhere within the fortress's inner wall, away from any corridor with outside access." "That will draw attention," Owen warned. "The court will ask why the collateral prisoner suddenly requires quarters typically reserved for—" "I do not care what it draws," Kane interrupted, a rare sharpness entering his voice. "I will not gamble her safety against the court's curiosity." Elena, informed of the incident the following morning, had argued gently against the disruption at first, reluctant to abandon the small, familiar comforts of the lower hall and the friends she had made there, particularly Clara, whose company had become one of the steadiest sources of comfort since her arrival. But Kane's quiet, unshakable insistence, and her own growing understanding of exactly how patient and calculating an enemy Damian Cross had proven himself to be, eventually won out. "I don't like it," Elena admitted, as guards carried her few belongings toward the new quarters Edmund had arranged within the fortress's most secure inner wing. "It feels like hiding." "It is not hiding," Kane said, walking beside her through the unfamiliar corridors. "It is refusing to make yourself an easy target for a man who has already shown he is willing to use you against everything I care about. There is a difference, even if it does not always feel that way." Elena said nothing further, though the incident lingered with her for days afterward, a persistent reminder that whatever peace and happiness she had found within these walls remained fragile, threatened by an enemy patient enough to wait for exactly the right moment to strike. She found herself, in the days that followed, paying closer attention to her surroundings again. The same careful vigilance that had once helped uncover Victor's betrayal now turned toward simple, personal survival. And though the immediate threat seemed to pass without further incident, the unease it left behind never fully faded. Not even in the warmest, most private moments she continued to share with Kane in the evenings that followed. That evening, once the fortress had settled into the quiet rhythms of night, Kane returned to the promise he had made on the rooftop terrace, the story he had begun to share before the urgent news of the border raid interrupted them. He found Elena in the west study, going over notes from the War Council by the light of a single lamp, and settled into the chair across from her with the particular stillness of a man preparing to speak about something that had cost him greatly to carry alone for so long. "I told you I wanted to explain why I built the walls you have spent these past weeks taking down," he said quietly. "I still want to, if you are willing to listen." Elena set aside her notes immediately, giving him her full attention. "I'm here. Take whatever time you need." Kane was quiet for a long moment, staring into the low fire burning in the hearth, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness Elena had rarely heard from him, even in their most private conversations. Her name was Ilsa, he said. We were meant to be mated the following spring, years ago now, though the memory feels closer than the calendar suggests it should. She was kind in a way I have rarely encountered since, patient with the pressures I carried as a young alpha, still learning how to lead a territory I had inherited far sooner than I was ready for. I loved her more completely than I believed myself capable of loving anyone. Elena said nothing, sensing that the story needed room to unfold at its own pace, without interruption. There was an attack, Kane continued, his voice carrying a controlled steadiness that Elena recognized as the sound of someone holding grief at careful arm's length, even after all these years. A rival territory, testing the strength of a young, untested king who had only recently taken his father's throne. We captured an enemy scout during the skirmish that followed, and my advisors urged immediate execution, the standard response to captured combatants in that kind of conflict. I refused. I believed mercy would prove something important, that it would show the northern territories a different kind of leadership than my father had offered, one built on more than fear alone. He paused, his jaw tightening, and Elena reached across the space between them to take his hand, offering silent support for whatever came next. The scout escaped that same night, Kane said, and led an ambush against a convoy traveling through our territory. 2 days later, Ilsa was traveling with that convoy, visiting a neighboring pack to arrange details for our upcoming mating ceremony. She was among those killed. The weight of the confession settled heavily into the quiet room, and Elena felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, an ache building in her chest for the pain still evident in his voice even after so many years. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. You couldn't have known what would happen. I have told myself that 1,000 times, Kane said, his voice rough with an emotion he made no attempt to fully hide now. It has never made the guilt easier to carry. I decided after that mercy was a weakness I could no longer afford, that every decision I made as king would be measured only by whether it protected this territory, never again by whether it made me feel like a good man in the process. I built the reputation everyone fears now, because I believed it was the only way to prevent something like that from ever happening again. And now? Elena asked gently. After everything we've been through these past weeks, do you still believe that? Kane looked at her then, something raw and uncertain in his expression that she had never seen from him before, not even in their most private moments together. I do not know anymore, he admitted. Meeting you has made me question every wall I built after Ilsa died. I do not know if that means I am becoming stronger, or if I am simply repeating a mistake I swore I would never make again. Caring about someone isn't a mistake, Elena said, her hand tightening around his. What happened to Ilsa was a tragedy, but it wasn't caused by mercy, and it wasn't caused by love. It was caused by an enemy who took advantage of a decision that, in different circumstances, could have been exactly the right one. You can't spend the rest of your life punishing yourself for trying to be better than the world expected you to be. Kane's hand tightened around hers, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, simply holding on, as though her presence was the only steady thing in a world that had otherwise given him very little reason to trust in anything soft or hopeful. I do not deserve the kindness you keep offering me, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe not, Elena said gently, but I'm offering it anyway, and I intend to keep offering it, for as long as you'll let me. Something shifted in his expression then, a wall she had watched him carefully maintain for weeks, finally cracking open into something that looked, for the first time since she had arrived at this fortress, almost like hope. He lifted her hand slowly and pressed a careful kiss against her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly gentle, from a man everyone called Merciless, that Elena felt tears spill freely down her cheeks now. I am afraid, Kane admitted quietly, the confession costing him something visible in the tension of his shoulders. I am afraid of what it means to care for you as deeply as I find myself caring, and I am afraid of what it might cost, both of us, if I allow myself to fully believe in this. I'm afraid too, Elena said, but I don't want to spend whatever time I have here pretending I don't feel what I feel, just because it's complicated and dangerous, and probably unwise given everything happening around us. Kane studied her for a long moment, and then, slowly, deliberately, he closed the remaining distance between them, resting his forehead gently against hers, the gesture more intimate than any kiss might have been, a quiet acknowledgement of two people choosing, despite every reason not to, to trust each other, with the fragile, guarded parts of themselves they had both spent so long protecting from further harm. "Then we will be afraid together," he said softly, "for as long as this lasts, and for as long as you will have me." The weeks following that quiet confession in the West study brought a new closeness between them that neither of them attempted to hide fully, though they remained careful about how openly they allowed it to be seen within the fortress's watchful corridors. Elena continued her work in the kitchens each morning, but her evenings belonged increasingly to Kane. Whether in the study reviewing border reports, on the rooftop terrace watching the sun set over the territory he had sworn to protect, or simply walking together through the quiet grounds after the rest of the fortress had settled for the night. Their closeness was not without its own tensions, moments where the very different lives they had each lived before finding each other collided in ways neither of them fully anticipated. It happened first over a matter that seemed small on its surface, a decision Kane made regarding increased patrols near the border pack Elena had visited, made without consulting her despite the fact that she now regularly contributed to such discussions. "You made the decision without telling me," Elena said, more hurt than angry, when she learned of it secondhand from Owen, rather than from Kane himself. "After everything, after the War Council listening to my input, you still decided this on your own." "It was a matter requiring immediate action," Kane said, though something in his tone suggested he understood, even as he spoke, that the explanation would not fully satisfy her. "There was no time to gather your thoughts on troop movements that needed to happen within the hour." "That's not really the point," Elena said, crossing her arms, more frustrated now that he seemed to be missing the deeper issue entirely. "The point is that you're used to deciding things alone, and old habits are hard to break, even when you've told me, more than once, that you value what I bring to these discussions. I don't need to approve every decision you make, Kane. I just don't want to be an afterthought in the moments that matter." Kane was quiet for a long moment, something working behind his careful expression as he considered her words more fully. "You are right," he admitted finally, the acknowledgement clearly costing him something significant. "I have let alone for so many years that consulting anyone, even you, does not yet come naturally to me in moments of urgency. That is not an excuse. It is simply the truth, and I will need to work at changing it." "I'm not asking you to change who you are," Elena said, her frustration softening slightly at his honesty. "I'm asking you to remember that this doesn't have to be a solitary burden anymore. Not with me here." "I will remember," Kane said quietly, reaching for her hand. "It may take practice, but I will remember." The disagreement, though brief, marked something important in the steady development of their relationship, a first real test of whether the trust and partnership they had built could withstand ordinary friction as well as extraordinary danger. Elena found, in the days that followed, that Kane made a visible, deliberate effort to include her more consistently, even in smaller decisions that did not strictly require her input, a small but meaningful demonstration that her earlier words had truly been heard, rather than simply acknowledged and forgotten. Clara, meanwhile, had her own quiet struggles during this same period, ones she did not initially share with Elena, though Elena noticed, with the same careful attention she brought to everything else within the fortress, that her friend had grown unusually withdrawn over several successive days. When she finally asked directly, Clara admitted, with visible reluctance, that a letter had arrived from her own family's territory, far to the south, informing her that her father had fallen seriously ill, and that she had no resources of her own to travel home, nor any certainty her position within the fortress kitchens would still exist if she took the time away to see him before it was too late. "I didn't want to burden you with it," Clara admitted, when Elena finally coaxed the truth from her during a quiet evening in the lower hall. "You have enough weighing on you already, without adding my troubles to the pile." "You've never once treated my troubles as a burden," Elena said firmly. "Let me help, please." She brought the matter to Kane that same evening, and though Clara initially protested the intervention, embarrassed at the thought of the king concerning himself with a kitchen worker's personal difficulties, Kane arranged, quietly and without fanfare, for Clara to travel south immediately, with a small guard escort, and sufficient resources to ensure her father received proper care, her position within the fortress kitchens held securely for her return. "You didn't have to do that," Clara said, tears in her eyes as she embraced Elena before departing. "Either of you. You've been kind to me since my very first day here," Elena said. "Family looks after family, Clara. That includes you now, whether you expected it or not. Clara returned 3 weeks later, her father recovering steadily thanks to the resources Kane had provided, and the gratitude she carried for that kindness deepened considerably the loyalty she had already felt toward both Elena and the king she served. A loyalty that would prove meaningful again, in ways none of them yet anticipated during the dangerous weeks still to come. Not everyone within the court viewed this closeness favorably. Aldrich, the grizzled officer who had grudgingly accepted Elena's strategic suggestion during the War Council, approached Kane privately one afternoon, with a concern he clearly felt obligated to voice, however uncomfortable the conversation might prove. "My king," Aldrich began carefully, finding Kane alone in the training yard during a rare quiet moment. "I mean no disrespect in raising this, but the court has noticed how closely you have drawn the Voss girl into matters of strategy and defense. Some among the officers wonder whether personal attachment might be clouding judgment that has always, until now, remained admirably clear." Kane's expression cooled instantly, though he did not immediately dismiss the concern outright, weighing it with the same careful consideration he brought to every strategic decision. "Her insight during the War Council proved sound, did it not? You said so yourself." "It did," Aldrich admitted. "I do not question her intelligence, or the value of her perspective. I question whether a king can remain fully objective about the safety of someone he has come to care for, as deeply as the court suspects you have come to care for her. Objectivity has always been your greatest strength, my king. I would hate to see it compromised at exactly the moment this territory needs it most." The words lingered with Kane, long after Aldrich had departed, and Elena noticed, that evening, a new heaviness in his demeanor that had not been present the day before. When she asked him directly what troubled him, he was honest with her, as he had promised to be, though the honesty clearly cost him something significant to voice aloud. "Aldrich believes my feelings for you may be compromising my judgment," Kane said, watching her reaction carefully. "He is not wrong to raise the concern. I have asked myself the same question more than once since that night on the rooftop terrace." Elena felt a flash of hurt, quickly followed by an effort to understand, rather than react defensively. "Do you believe it's true? That caring for me has made you less capable of leading this territory?" "No," Kane said firmly, without hesitation. "If anything, I believe the opposite. Your perspective has strengthened every strategic decision we have made since Victor's exposure. But I understand why the court questions it, and I understand that perception matters as much as reality when it comes to maintaining the confidence of officers who have served this territory far longer than you have been within these walls." "So what do we do?" Elena asked. "Pretend this isn't happening? Go back to careful distance and formal meetings, just to satisfy officers who don't understand what we've actually built together?" "No," Kane said again, reaching for her hand with a certainty that steadied the anxious flutter building in her chest. "I will not pretend away something that has become this important to me, simply to satisfy concerns that, however reasonable on their surface, misunderstand the nature of what exists between us. But I do need to find a way to demonstrate to the court that my judgment remains sound, that caring for you has made this territory stronger rather than weaker." An opportunity to do exactly that arrived sooner than either of them expected, in the form of a second, smaller raid against a different border pack, this one closer to Elena's own family's territory than the first attack had been. Kane assembled his officers quickly, and this time, rather than simply allowing Elena to offer her perspective from the sidelines of the discussion, he formally invited her to present a full analysis of the pattern emerging across both raids, watching with quiet satisfaction as she laid out, with careful precision, exactly how Cross's tactics had shifted since Victor's removal, and what that shift suggested about his remaining resources and intentions. "He's spreading his forces thinner than the first raid suggested," Elena said, pointing to the map spread across the council table, marking the locations of both attacks with careful precision. "If he had the numbers for a sustained, coordinated campaign, he would be striking multiple points simultaneously, not sequentially. This suggests his available forces are more limited than we initially feared, which means the patient defense strategy we adopted is already working exactly as intended, forcing him to spend resources testing weaknesses rather than committing to any single decisive action." Aldrich studied the map for a long moment, his expression shifting from careful skepticism into something closer to genuine respect. "She is right," he said finally, addressing Kane directly. I withdraw my earlier concern, my king. Whatever influence this young woman holds over your judgment, it appears to be sharpening it rather than clouding it. The acknowledgement settled something anxious in Kane's chest that Elena had not fully realized he was carrying until she watched it visibly ease. After the council dispersed, he found her alone near the training grounds and pulled her into a careful embrace, the gesture more open than anything he had allowed himself in front of the fortress before. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for proving, again, exactly what I already knew to be true." "You don't need to thank me for being honest about what I see," Elena said, leaning into him. "But I'm glad Aldrich understands now. It matters, having the court's trust, not just yours." "It does," Kane agreed, "and we are closer to earning it fully than I believed possible when Aldrich first raised his concerns." Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed by the wider fortress, whispers, following them through corridors that had once held only fearful silence for their king, though the tone of those whispers had begun, slowly, to shift from wariness into something closer to curious approval. Clara reported, during one of their evening conversations in the lower hall, that even among the kitchen staff, opinion had turned largely in Elena's favor. "They see how the border defenses have held," Clara said. "They hear how the War Council listens to you now, not just the king. People respect strength, Elena, and whatever you're doing, it looks like strength to everyone watching." The observation settled warmly in Elena's chest, though beneath the growing confidence and hope building steadily within her, a quieter unease remained, awareness that Cross had not yet exhausted his resources, that Victor's exposure and the failed raids had likely only sharpened his determination rather than diminished it, and that whatever peace she and Kane had found together still existed within the shadow of a conflict that had not yet reached its full and terrible conclusion. She did not know, in those quiet, hopeful weeks, exactly how close that conclusion truly was, or how completely it would test everything she and Kane had built together, since the day chains first bound her wrists in a cold, silent hall that felt, now, like a memory belonging to an entirely different life. During this same stretch of weeks, Elena asked Kane for something she had been considering carefully for some time, ever since the fear of that near miss with the disturbed fencing had settled uneasily into her thoughts. "Teach me," she said one evening, finding him alone on the training grounds during his usual dawn practice. "Not to be a soldier, just enough to protect myself, if it ever comes to that again." Kane studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his expression. "It is not an easy thing to learn quickly," he said carefully, "and I would rather you never need it at all." "I'd rather that too," Elena said. "But wanting something doesn't make it true. I'd feel safer knowing I could defend myself, even a little, instead of only ever hoping someone arrives in time to do it for me." Something in the quiet, practical determination of her request seemed to settle whatever hesitation Kane carried, and he nodded slowly, gesturing toward the practice weapons stacked along the fence. "Then we begin simply," he said. "Balance, first. Everything else depends on it." Their early morning sessions became a new, cherished part of Elena's routine over the following weeks. Kane patient and thorough in his instruction, correcting her stance with careful hands, demonstrating movements slowly enough that she could study and repeat them without frustration overtaking her progress. She was not, she quickly discovered, naturally gifted with a blade, or with the particular discipline of unarmed combat that came instinctively to wolves raised from childhood in fortress training yards. But she was determined, and stubborn in the same way that had first drawn Kane's attention in the great hall so many weeks before. And slowly, session by session, her movements grew steadier, more confident, less like someone flailing against danger, and more like someone who understood, at least in small part, how to meet it. "You're improving," Kane told her one morning, after she successfully executed a defensive maneuver he had been drilling for over a week, without once losing her footing, "faster than I expected, given how little time we have for practice most days." "I have good motivation," Elena said, slightly breathless from the exertion, though pride was evident in her expression. "I don't intend to be taken by surprise again, not without putting up more of a fight than I managed the first time danger found me." Those quiet morning sessions became, in their own way, as important to the growing bond between them as their evening conversations in the study or their walks along the rooftop terrace. A shared discipline that let Kane offer her something concrete and useful, a skill, rather than only protection extended from a distance, and let Elena feel, for the first time since arriving at the fortress, that her safety depended not solely on others but, in some meaningful part, on herself. It was during this same period, though neither of them spoke of it directly yet, that Cain first began to notice something shifting within his own wolf, a restlessness that had remained dormant since Ilsa's death, stirring now every time Elena entered a room, every time her voice carried down a corridor before he could see her. He told himself, at first, that it was simply the natural result of spending so much time in her company, a fondness deepening the way fondness naturally deepens between two people who trust each other completely. He did not yet allow himself to consider what it might actually mean, though the awareness lingered at the edges of his thoughts more persistently with each passing day. Elena noticed changes too, though she attributed them to nothing more mysterious than the growing comfort of a relationship built slowly and carefully over weeks of shared danger and shared trust. She found herself thinking of him constantly, throughout her days in the kitchens, anticipating their evening conversations with an eagerness she had never expected to feel for anyone, let alone the man who had once seemed, on that first terrifying day in the great hall, entirely incapable of warmth. One quiet evening, as autumn settled more firmly over the northern territory and the training grounds grew colder beneath early morning frost, Elena found herself sitting beside Cain on the rooftop terrace, wrapped in a heavy cloak against the chill, watching stars emerge slowly across a clear night sky. "Do you ever think about what happens after all of this?" she asked quietly. "After Cross is dealt with, after the debt is settled, whatever that ends up looking like?" Cain was quiet for a long moment, his arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. "I have tried not to," he admitted. It felt safer somehow, to focus only on the immediate danger in front of us, rather than imagining a future I was not certain I would be allowed to have. "And now?" Elena pressed gently. "Now I find myself thinking about it more often than I probably should, given everything still unresolved," Cain said. "I think about you, still here, long after the debt no longer matters. I think about a fortress that feels less like a cold seat of power and more like the home it should have been all along." He paused, something vulnerable entering his voice. "I do not know if that future is realistic, given everything we still face. But I find myself wanting it more than I have wanted anything in a very long time." Elena leaned into him, warmth spreading through her chest despite the cold night air. "I want that too," she said softly. "I came here terrified, thinking I was sacrificing years of my life to protect my family. I never imagined I might find something here worth staying for, even after the debt was gone." "Your family will always be welcome here," Cain said. "Whatever happens between us, I will not forget what your father risked, sending you north to protect them. That debt of gratitude runs deeper than any financial obligation ever could." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the stars wheeling slowly overhead, and Elena found herself, for the first time since arriving at the fortress, allowing herself to imagine a future that stretched beyond the immediate crisis surrounding them. A future where the danger had passed, and what remained was simply this: two people who had found each other, against every reasonable expectation, choosing, deliberately and completely, to build something lasting together. She did not yet know how quickly that fragile, hopeful vision would be tested, or how close they were about to come to losing it entirely, before they had even fully allowed themselves to believe in it. In the days following the War Council, where her strategy had first been formally adopted, Elena asked Cain for permission to travel, under careful guard, to the smaller pack that had suffered the first raid, wanting to see for herself the damage Cross's forces had inflicted, and to offer what comfort and practical help she could to families whose losses felt, to her, uncomfortably close to the kind of hardship her own family had faced for years. Cain hesitated before agreeing, concerned for her safety so soon after confirming the danger Cross posed, but something in Elena's quiet, determined insistence convinced him the visit mattered enough to justify the risk, provided Owen and a full company of guards accompanied her the entire way. The pack she found, 2 days' ride from the fortress, bore the visible scars of the raid clearly: a burned grain store still smelling faintly of smoke, fences hastily repaired with mismatched timber, families doubling up in whatever shelter remained intact, while winter approached faster than anyone wanted to consider. The pack's beta, an older woman named Freya who had lost nearly everything stored for the coming cold months, met Elena with a wary, exhausted courtesy that softened, gradually, as Elena knelt beside her in the ruined grain store and began, without being asked, helping to sort through what little remained that might still be salvaged. "You didn't have to come yourself," Freya said, watching Elena work with an expression that carried equal parts surprise and gratitude. The king could have sent supplies without sending his intended alongside them. "I wanted to see it myself," Elena said honestly, brushing ash from her hands. "I grew up in a small border pack too. I know what it feels like when the cold months arrive, and the stores aren't what they should be. I didn't want this to be something I only read about in a report." Freya studied her for a long moment, something in her weathered expression shifting into quiet respect. "The king chose well," she said finally. "Better than any of us understood, watching from a distance, worrying what a human collateral prisoner might mean for the strength of this territory's leadership." Elena spent 2 full days at the pack, helping organize the distribution of supplies Cain had sent ahead of her arrival, listening to families describe what they had lost and what they still feared might come. And by the time she departed, she carried with her a clearer, more personal understanding of exactly what was at stake in the conflict still building around them, an understanding that sharpened her resolve rather than diminishing her hope. She returned to the fortress, changed in ways she did not fully articulate, even to Cain, though he noticed the shift in her immediately, a new steadiness beneath her warmth, a determination that had hardened into something unshakable. It was in the days following that visit, watching her move through the fortress with this deepened sense of purpose, that Cain's wolf finally surrendered completely to a recognition it had been circling for weeks. The certainty arrived for Cain on an ordinary morning, without warning, without ceremony, while he stood at the edge of the training grounds, watching the sun rise over frost-covered earth. Elena crossed the yard in the distance, carrying a basket toward the kitchens, calling out a greeting to one of the younger guards as she passed, and Cain's wolf surged forward with a force that nearly buckled his careful control entirely, a certainty settling into him that he had spent years believing he would never feel again. She was his mate. Not a possibility, not a growing fondness that might one day deepen into something more permanent. His wolf had already decided, with the absolute, unshakable certainty wolves reserved only for matters of the heart, and the realization terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced across a battlefield, more than Cross's entire network of spies and scouts combined. He avoided her for 3 days after that morning, burying himself in border reports and council correspondence, sending word through Edmund rather than summoning her himself, telling himself the distance was necessary, a chance to think clearly before he did something he could not undo. He told himself he was protecting her, protecting them both, from a bond that would make her an even greater target than she had already become in Cross's calculations. Elena noticed immediately, of course. She had spent weeks learning the particular rhythms of his moods, the small signals that told her when something troubled him deeply enough to retreat behind the careful walls he had built long before she arrived at this fortress. She gave him 1 day, then 2, telling herself he needed space to work through whatever burden had settled over him. By the 3rd day, worry had overtaken patience entirely, and she went looking for him herself. She found him on the rooftop terrace, standing alone at the railing, his posture carrying a tension she had not seen from him since the night of the intruder alarm weeks earlier. "You've been avoiding me," she said, joining him at the railing, close enough to feel the tension radiating from him, but careful not to close the last few inches between them. "I have," Cain admitted, not bothering to deny it. "I needed time to think." "About what?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the stone railing hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. "My wolf has recognized you," he said finally. The words dropped into the space between them like a stone into still water. "As my mate. It happened days ago, and I have been trying, unsuccessfully, to convince myself it means something other than what it clearly means." Elena felt her breath catch, a rush of emotion she could not entirely name moving through her, hope and fear tangling together so completely she could not separate one from the other. "And that frightens you?" "Yes," Cain said, with the particular bluntness of a man who had decided honesty was less painful than continuing to pretend. "The last time I allowed myself to love someone completely, I lost her because of a decision I made in the name of that love. I do not know how to trust myself with something this important again. I do not know how to trust that caring for you will not eventually cost you your life, the way caring for Ilsa cost her hers. That's not fair, Elena said, hurt cutting through the sympathy she also felt for the pain evident in his voice. You can't decide how to feel about me based on what happened to someone else, years before I ever came into this fortress. I'm not her. Whatever happened to Ilsa doesn't have to happen to me. You do not know that, Kane said, his voice rising slightly, with a frustration that seemed directed as much at himself as at her. Cross is more dangerous now than the enemy who took her from me ever was. If he learns what you mean to me, he will see you as a weapon to use against this entire territory, and I will not be able to protect you the way I could not protect her. So your solution is to push me away, Elena said, to decide for both of us that this isn't worth the risk, without even asking what I think about it? Kane turned to face her fully, something raw and conflicted twisting across his features. I am trying to protect you. You're trying to protect yourself, Elena said, the words sharper than she intended, but no less true for it. You're so afraid of losing someone again that you'd rather push me away before you can even find out if this is worth fighting for. That's not protection, Kane. That's fear, dressed up as strategy, and I thought you were better than that. The accusation landed harder than she expected, and for a moment, Kane said nothing at all, simply staring at her, with an expression that shifted through several emotions too quickly for her to name them all. Then something in his shoulders sagged, the careful control finally giving way to something more honest. You are right, he admitted quietly. I am afraid. I have been afraid since the moment my wolf recognized you, because I do not know how to survive losing someone I love a second time, and some cowardly part of me believes that if I never fully allow myself this, I will never have to find out. I can't promise you nothing bad will ever happen, Elena said, softening now that he had let his guard down enough to be honest with her. Nobody can promise that. But I don't want to spend whatever time we have pretending we don't feel what we feel, just because you're scared of what it might cost. That's not living, Kane. That's just a slower kind of losing. Kane closed the distance between them then, his hands coming up to gently frame her face, his eyes searching hers as though looking for some final confirmation, before he allowed himself to fully believe what his wolf had already decided weeks ago. I do not deserve someone who sees through my fear so clearly, he said quietly. Maybe not, Elena said, echoing the words she had offered him once before, with the same gentle certainty. But I'm here anyway. He kissed her then, finally, the careful distance between them dissolving completely, as his lips met hers, gentle at first, and then deepening, as weeks of restrained feeling finally found their release. Elena melted into him, her hands finding the front of his coat, holding on as though she could keep this moment from slipping away simply by refusing to let go. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kane rested his forehead against hers, his voice barely above a whisper. I choose this, he said. I choose you. Despite every fear telling me it is unwise, my wolf chose you weeks ago. I am only now catching up to what it already understood. Then we're choosing each other, Elena said softly. Whatever comes next. Elsewhere in the fortress, unseen and unsuspected, a young guard named Gareth stood watch at the eastern gate, his mind churning with anxieties that had nothing to do with the growing bond between his king and the collateral prisoner everyone had begun calling, in careful whispers, the future queen. Gareth's own family remained in a border territory long since fallen under Damian Cross's shadow, and 3 weeks earlier, a quiet visitor had found him during a solitary patrol and made clear, in language that left no room for misunderstanding, exactly what would happen to his mother and younger sisters if he refused to provide small pieces of information whenever asked. He had told himself, each time he answered a careful question about guard rotations or gate schedules, that he was providing nothing significant, nothing that could truly harm anyone. He had not yet been asked anything that felt, to his own uneasy conscience, like real betrayal. But he understood, watching the guards change shifts along the eastern wall that evening, that the quiet visitor would return eventually, with a request he could not so easily excuse away, and he was already beginning, in the private terror of his own thoughts, to dread exactly what that request might be. News of the bond between the king and his collateral prisoner spread through the fortress with a speed that startled even Elena, who had expected, given the careful discretion they had both tried to maintain, that the truth might remain private for at least a little while longer. Instead, within a day of their reunion on the rooftop terrace, whispers had already transformed into open, if still cautious, conversation among the guards and kitchen staff, curiosity and approval mingling with a lingering, understandable wariness about what such a bond might mean for the future of the territory. Clara found her in the kitchens the following morning, practically vibrating with excitement she struggled to contain. "It's true then," she said, pulling Elena aside, before Marta could assign either of them to their morning tasks. "Everyone's saying the king has claimed you as his mate. Is it true?" "It's true," Elena said, unable to keep a small, helpless smile from spreading across her face, despite the seriousness of everything still surrounding them. Clara let out a delighted laugh, pulling Elena into a quick, fierce embrace. "I knew it. From that very first day, when you told him your name in front of the entire hall. I knew there was something different about you." Her expression sobered slightly, though warmth remained beneath the concern. "This changes things, Elena. For you, and for how the whole court will see you from now on." "I know," Elena said. "I'm still trying to understand exactly what it means myself." It meant, over the following days, a shift in how she was treated throughout the fortress. Guards who had once regarded her with wary neutrality, now offering respectful nods as she passed. Officers who had previously spoken to her only when strategy required it, now seeking her opinion more readily during council discussions. Edmund, in particular, seemed to regard the development with quiet, careful approval, taking it upon himself to begin instructing her, gently and without pressure, in the customs and responsibilities that would eventually accompany her new position within the territory. "There is no need to rush any of this," Edmund assured her, during one such conversation. Finding her in the archives, reviewing border reports she had begun, increasingly, to study on her own initiative. "The king will not force a formal bonding ceremony before you are ready for it, but it would serve you well to understand what such a role would eventually require, so that whenever the day arrives, you meet it with confidence rather than uncertainty." Elena appreciated the guidance, though beneath the growing excitement and hope building steadily within her, a quieter unease remained, a persistent awareness that Cross had not yet exhausted his resources, that Victor's exposure and the failed border raids had likely only sharpened his determination rather than diminished it. She mentioned this concern to Kane one evening, and watched his expression grow serious in a way that told her he shared the same worry, even amid the happiness they had both finally allowed themselves to embrace. "I will not let my guard down," Kane assured her, drawing her close. "If anything, our bond gives Cross a new target to consider, a new pressure point he may attempt to exploit. I have already increased security around you specifically, quietly enough that I hope it will not draw attention, but thoroughly enough that I believe you remain as safe as I can make you within these walls." "I trust you," Elena said, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Neither of them could have known, in that quiet, hopeful moment, exactly how soon and how completely that trust would be tested, or how close the danger, already gathering around them, truly was. The quiet visitor returned to Gareth 8 days later, finding him again during a solitary evening patrol, along a stretch of the eastern wall, rarely watched by other guards at that hour. This time, the visitor did not ask for schedules or rotations. This time, the request was far more specific, and far more dangerous, and Gareth felt his stomach drop the moment he understood what was being asked of him. "We need information about the Collateral prisoner," the visitor said, his voice low and businesslike, as though discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "Her routine, which guards accompany her, and at which hours. The routes she typically walks between the kitchens and the lower hall." "Why?" Gareth asked, though some fearful part of him had already guessed the answer, dreading it even as the question left his mouth. "That is not your concern," the visitor said. "Your concern is your mother and your sisters, and whether they continue living peacefully in a territory that answers, whether your king wishes to admit it or not, increasingly to Damian Cross's authority. Provide what we ask, and your family remains safe. Refuse, and I cannot promise the same." Gareth spent 3 sleepless nights, turning the request over in his mind, torn between loyalty to a king who had shown him nothing but fair treatment during his years of service, and desperate fear for a family he had not seen in over a year, trapped in circumstances he had no power to change from 200 miles away. In the end, fear won, as the visitor had clearly calculated it would, and Gareth provided the information requested, telling himself, with the same hollow justification he had used before, that he was simply protecting his family, that whatever happened next was not truly his doing. The attack came on a morning that began like any other, Elena walking from the kitchens toward the lower hall after finishing her early shift, accompanied by only a single guard along a route that had become routine enough that neither of them thought to be especially watchful. She was thinking, as she walked, about the conversation she and Kane had shared the previous evening, about a formal announcement Edmund had begun quietly planning for the following month, about a future that felt, for the first time since her arrival at this fortress, genuinely bright and full of promise. The ambush was quick and efficient, a small group of Cross's agents emerging from a service corridor rarely used at that hour, overwhelming the single guard before he could raise an alarm, and pulling Elena, struggling and calling out, through a hidden exit that Gareth's information had ensured remained unwatched at exactly this moment. A cloth pressed roughly over her mouth muffled her cries, and strong hands bound her wrists behind her back before she could gather enough breath to fight back effectively. She was half carried, half dragged through a series of narrow, unfamiliar corridors, and out through a gate she had never known existed, into a waiting cart concealed beneath a covering of grain sacks. And by the time she managed to work enough slack into her bindings to attempt any real resistance, the cart was already moving swiftly away from the fortress, carrying her toward the eastern border, and whatever fate Damien Cross had prepared for her. By the time her absence was noticed, nearly an hour had passed, the single guard found unconscious in the abandoned corridor, and the trail leading away from the fortress had already grown cold enough that tracking her would require far more than simple pursuit. Kane received the news in the middle of a council session, Owen's face pale and urgent as he delivered the report, and something inside him that had remained carefully controlled for years shattered completely in the space of a single sentence. Elena was gone, taken, and every instinct he possessed, every fear he had voiced on the rooftop terrace weeks earlier, rose up at once with a force that nearly drove him to his knees in front of the assembled council. "How?" he demanded, his voice carrying a barely restrained fury that sent every officer in the room instinctively stepping back. How did anyone get close enough to take her without immediate detection? "We believe someone within the fortress provided information," Owen said carefully. "There are inconsistencies in the Eastern Gate reports that need to be explained immediately." Kane's wolf surged forward, with a violence he had not felt since the earliest days of his reign, the animal recognizing what his human mind had already understood in that first terrible moment. His mate had been taken by the very enemy who had once cost him everything, and he was not prepared, this time, to lose her the same way he had lost Ilsa. "Find whoever provided that information," he said, his voice deadly quiet in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "Question every guard who had access to that corridor. I want answers within the hour, and I want every available fighter prepared to move the moment we know where she has been taken." The investigation moved with brutal speed once it began. Guards questioned one after another, records cross-checked against every reported movement near the Eastern Gate that morning, until Gareth's nervous, inconsistent explanations drew suspicion almost immediately. Faced with Owen's unflinching questioning and understanding, finally, the full weight of what his fear had allowed to happen, Gareth confessed everything within minutes. The threats against his family, the information he had provided, the location where Cross's agents had planned to take their prisoner, a fortified outpost near the eastern border, close enough to Cross territory, that reaching it in time would require moving faster than any force Kane had assembled in recent memory. Meanwhile, Elena found herself bound and confined in a small, windowless room within the outpost, her mind racing through every possible way to free herself, even as fear threatened to overwhelm her careful attempts at strategy. She had been separated from her captors for the moment, left alone while they, she assumed, communicated with whoever had ordered her capture, and she used the time to study her surroundings with the same careful attention she had once used to notice patterns within the Draven fortress, an attention that had, in these past weeks, become second nature to her. The rope binding her wrists was tightly knotted, but not expertly so, and after nearly 20 minutes of patient, careful work, ignoring the raw ache building where the rope chafed against her skin, she managed to loosen it enough to slip one hand free. The door to her room was locked, but the window, though small, was not barred, and she calculated, with the cold clarity of someone whose survival depended on clear thinking, that she might be able to fit through it if she moved quickly enough, provided she was not discovered before she found the right moment. Before she could act on the plan, the door opened, and a man she recognized immediately, despite having only seen him once before across a crowded council hall, stepped into the room. Felix, Damien Cross's second, studied her with an expression of calculated satisfaction that made her skin crawl. "The king's collateral," he said, his voice carrying the particular smoothness of someone accustomed to negotiating from positions of power, or perhaps something more than collateral, judging by how quickly he assembled every available fighter the moment word reached him that you were missing. News travels quickly, it seems, even across contested borders. "What do you want from me?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. "Leverage," Felix said simply. "Damien has been searching for a way to force the Draven King into a conflict he cannot win cleanly. One that will expose weaknesses in his territory, that we can exploit fully. You, it seems, have become exactly the leverage we needed, whether you intended to or not." "He won't negotiate with you," Elena said. "Not the way you're hoping. He's smarter than that." Felix smiled, an expression with no warmth in it at all. "We shall see. Love makes even the most controlled men reckless, and reckless men make mistakes." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. "Rest while you can. It will be some time before anyone reaches you, and I suspect the king will not be in a particularly patient mood when he does." The door closed and locked behind him, and Elena allowed herself, for just a moment, to feel the full weight of her fear, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes, before she forced them back, refusing to let panic take hold of her, when clear thinking was the only real weapon she had. But beneath the fear, steadier than she expected, ran a certainty she clung to with everything she had. Cain was coming for her. She had seen enough of him, in their weeks together, to know that whatever careful control he wore in front of his court, whatever fear he had voiced about loving someone again, none of it would stop him from doing everything in his power to bring her home safely. Before she could act further, footsteps approached the door again, and Elena quickly slid her freed hand back beneath the loosened rope, arranging herself to appear as bound and defeated as her captors expected her to be. The door opened to reveal not Felix but a younger guard, barely older than Elena herself, carrying a plate of bread and water that he set down just inside the doorway without meeting her eyes. "You don't seem to enjoy this work," Elena said quietly, studying him with careful attention, searching for whatever weakness she might use to her advantage. The guard glanced up, startled that she had spoken to him at all. "It isn't my place to enjoy or dislike it," he said, though something uncertain flickered behind his eyes. "I do as I'm ordered." "Everyone who has ever done something they weren't proud of has said exactly that," Elena said gently, remembering, even in her fear, the lesson she had learned from Gareth's eventual confession weeks later, though she could not have known that yet. "What's your name?" The guard hesitated, some instinct clearly warning him against engaging further with a prisoner he had been ordered simply to feed and guard. "It doesn't matter," he said finally, turning to leave. "It matters to me," Elena said, echoing, without fully realizing it, the words she had once spoken to a king in a cold, silent hall many months before. "Whatever happens here, I'd like to know the name of the person who at least made certain I had food and water." The guard paused at the door, something in her simple, steady kindness clearly catching him off guard. "Ren," he said finally, quietly, before pulling the door shut and locking it firmly behind him. Elena filed the small exchange away carefully, understanding instinctively that even the smallest crack in her captor's resolve might prove useful, whether through information Ren might inadvertently reveal during future visits, or through the simple, practical fact that a guard reluctant in his duties was less likely to notice a prisoner working quietly toward her own escape. She returned her attention to the rope at her wrists, freeing her hand fully this time, and moved toward the window with a renewed, careful determination. She finished freeing her hands, moved quietly to the window, and began, methodically and without panic, working out exactly how she might weaken her captor's position from the inside, long before anyone arrived to rescue her at all. She studied the outpost's layout through the narrow window as best she could, noting the placement of supply stores, the pattern of guard movements in the yard below, storing every detail away with the same careful attention that had once helped uncover Victor's betrayal within the Draven fortress itself. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the changing quality of light through the narrow window and the muffled sounds of activity elsewhere in the outpost. When the guards outside her door finally changed shifts, the new guard, younger and visibly less experienced than the one before him, wandering further from his post than caution should have allowed, Elena recognized her opportunity had finally arrived, and she began, carefully and quietly, to put her plan into motion. Cain moved through the Eastern Territory faster than any force in recent memory, driven by a focus so absolute that even Owen, who had served beside him through years of difficult campaigns, found himself struggling to match the pace his king demanded. They traveled through the remainder of that day and deep into the night, tracking the trail Gareth's confession had provided, every hour that passed sharpening the desperate urgency that had settled over the entire company, like a physical weight pressing down on every rider. "You should rest, even briefly," Owen said carefully, as they paused to change horses at a small way station, well past midnight. "We will do her no good arriving exhausted and unable to think clearly." "I cannot rest," Cain said, his voice carrying an edge Owen had rarely heard from him, even during the darkest days following Ilsa's death. "Every moment I spend resting is a moment Felix has her, a moment Cross has to decide what use he intends to make of her. I will rest once she is safe, and not one moment before." Owen did not argue further, understanding the futility of reasoning with a king whose wolf had recognized its mate in danger, a bond that overrode careful strategy with an urgency deeper than logic could reach. They pressed on through the darkness, Cain's mind working relentlessly through every possible approach to the outpost, every strategy that might free Elena without triggering violence, that could endanger her further in the chaos of a direct confrontation. "Felix will expect a frontal assault," Cain said finally, breaking the silence as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, the outpost now visible in the far distance as a dark shape against the brightening horizon. Brute strength meeting brute strength, exactly the kind of reckless response he predicted Elena's capture would provoke. "We will not give him that satisfaction." "What would you have us do instead?" Owen asked. "Divide our approach," Cain said, already working through the details as he spoke them aloud. A visible force approaching from the main road, enough to draw their attention and their defensive preparations toward the front of the outpost. Meanwhile, a smaller, quieter group circles toward the rear, where the supply stores and lesser-used entrances offer a path inside that Felix will not be watching as closely, focused as he will be on the obvious threat approaching from the front. Owen nodded slowly, already calculating logistics. "It will require precise timing, too early, and the smaller group risks discovery before the main force draws sufficient attention. Too late, and Felix may already have moved her, or worse, decided her usefulness as leverage has expired. Then we will be precise," Cain said, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "I have not come this far to fail her now." Inside the outpost, Elena had spent the hours since Felix's visit, working methodically toward her own contribution to whatever rescue might be coming, refusing to simply wait passively for salvation to arrive. She had used her freed hands to carefully loosen a section of the window frame, weakened by age and neglect, prying gently at the old wood until it gave slightly beneath her patient, persistent effort, and had spent long, careful minutes listening to the patterns of the guards stationed outside her door, memorizing their rotations, their moments of distraction, the small gaps in their vigilance that careful patience might exploit when the right moment finally arrived. When the guards changed shifts again, exactly as she had hoped, she recognized her opportunity. The new guard, younger and less experienced than the one before him, grew careless within the first hour of his watch, wandering further from the door than his post technically allowed, drawn by the sound of activity elsewhere in the outpost that Elena suspected, correctly, signaled the beginning of whatever confrontation Cain's approaching force had triggered. Elena worked quickly, pulling the weakened window frame free with a soft, controlled motion, wincing as splinters bit into her palms and slipped through the narrow opening into the cool morning air beyond, her heart pounding so hard she was certain it must be audible to anyone nearby. She found herself in a narrow service alley between two sections of the outpost, and rather than fleeing immediately toward whatever safety the surrounding countryside might offer, she paused, remembering everything she had observed about the outpost structure during her captivity, and made a decision that surprised even herself in its boldness. Instead of running, she moved toward the supply stores she had glimpsed through the gap in the walls during her careful observations, working quickly to loosen the ties on several crates, stacked precariously near the outpost's main gathering yard. Crates that, if toppled at the right moment amid the chaos of an approaching assault, would create exactly the kind of confusion and disorder that might give a rescue force the critical advantage it needed to succeed without excessive bloodshed. Her hands moved quickly, driven by adrenaline and a fierce determination that had carried her through every danger she had faced since first walking through the Draven fortress gates in chains, and she had barely finished loosening the last of the crate ties when the unmistakable sound of an approaching, organized force reached her from beyond the outpost walls, careful and coordinated, growing louder with each passing second, and she understood, with a surge of relief so powerful it nearly buckled her knees beneath her, that the rescue she had been praying for through every long, frightened hour of her captivity had finally, truly arrived. The main force struck the front gate of the outpost with deliberate, controlled force, enough noise and visible strength to draw every available defender toward the front walls, exactly as Cain had calculated. Felix, roused from whatever quiet satisfaction he had been enjoying at the success of his plan, rushed toward the gate himself, shouting orders to organize a defense against what appeared, from the outpost's perspective, to be a furious, grief-stricken king, throwing every resource he possessed into a reckless, doomed assault. He did not notice, in the chaos of those first critical minutes, the smaller, quieter group moving swiftly along the outpost's rear wall, slipping through a service entrance left unwatched, precisely because every defender's attention had been drawn toward the more obvious threat unfolding at the front gate. Aldrich, leading the visible force at the front, played his role with the same disciplined precision he had once brought to Cain's own war council, ordering measured, controlled advances that looked, from the outpost's defensive position, exactly like a furious king, throwing every available fighter into a reckless assault. Shouted commands echoed across the outpost yard as defenders scrambled to reinforce the gate, and in the confusion, Ren, the young guard who had brought Elena bread and water only hours before, found himself pulled from his post near the supply stores and ordered toward the front lines, exactly the shift in coverage the rear approach had been counting on. The crates Elena had carefully loosened earlier that morning became the final piece of the plan, toppling with a tremendous crash the moment the rear group brushed against them in their approach, sending grain and splintered wood scattering across the yard and drawing the attention of the few remaining guards positioned near the outpost's interior. In the resulting confusion, Owen's smaller group moved swiftly through the gap that confusion created, disarming startled defenders with efficient, controlled force that left injuries but no lives lost, exactly as Cain had insisted before they ever set out from the fortress. No unnecessary bloodshed, Cain had told his officers during the hurried planning session the night before. Cross wants a war built on grievance and vengeance. I will not hand him a massacre to point to as justification for whatever he intends to do next. We take her back, and we take her back clean. That discipline held, even as the fighting intensified near the outpost center, guards who recognized the shifting tide of the confrontation, increasingly choosing surrender over continued resistance, understanding, as trained soldiers often do, exactly when a fight had already been decided, beyond any hope of reversal. Elena, crouched in the shadow of the supply stores she had just finished compromising, watched the smaller group approach with a rising, desperate hope, and when she recognized Owen moving low and careful along the outer wall, she nearly called out before catching herself, understanding instinctively that silence remained her best contribution to whatever came next. And then she saw Cain. He had abandoned the visible force at the front gate the moment the diversion succeeded in drawing sufficient attention, circling back to join the smaller group, approaching from the rear, with a speed and ferocity that spoke more clearly than any words could have, of the desperation and fear he had carried through every hour since learning she was gone. He moved through the growing chaos of the outpost with a focus and precision Elena had never witnessed from him before, every motion economical, every decision made with the clear-eyed certainty of a man who had spent years training for exactly this kind of crisis, a man whose wolf had taken over completely, driven by nothing but the singular, overwhelming need to reach his mate. When his eyes finally found her, standing safely in the shadow of the supply stores she had just helped to compromise, something in his expression broke open completely. Relief, and fury, and love, all warring across his features at once. Raw, and unguarded in a way Elena had never seen from him before, not even in their most private, honest moments together. He crossed the distance between them in moments, pulling her into his arms, with a desperate intensity that spoke more clearly than any words could have, of the fear he had carried since learning she was gone. "You are safe," he said, his voice rough, with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. "I thought," he stopped, unable to finish the sentence, simply holding her tighter instead, his entire body trembling with the force of relief crashing through him. "I'm safe," Elena confirmed, her own voice unsteady with relief, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, now that the danger had passed enough for her to allow herself to feel it fully. "I knew you'd come. I never doubted it, not once. I would have torn this entire outpost apart with my bare hands to find you," Kane said, pulling back just enough to study her face, checking for any sign of harm, his hands moving gently over her arms, her shoulders, as though needing physical confirmation that she remained whole and unharmed. "I could not lose you the way I lost her. I could not survive that a second time, Elena. I would not have survived it." "You didn't lose me," Elena said gently, reaching up to touch his face, her thumb brushing away a smear of dust and exhaustion from his jaw. "I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." Their reunion was interrupted by the sound of Felix's voice, sharp with fury, as he emerged from the outpost's main structure, flanked by several remaining guards who had not yet been overwhelmed by Kane's swift, coordinated assault, the diversion at the front gate finally collapsing entirely, as defenders realized, too late, that the true threat had already breached their walls from an entirely unexpected direction. "This changes nothing," Felix called out, though the confidence in his voice had noticeably thinned, cracking at the edges as he took in the scene before him, his carefully constructed plan unraveling faster than he had prepared himself to accept. "Damien will simply try again. You cannot protect her forever, Draven." Kane released Elena gently, though his hand remained firmly wrapped around hers, stepping forward with the particular calm of a man who had already decided exactly how this confrontation would end. "Tell Damien Cross that his campaign against this territory ends today," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the outpost grounds, steady and absolute in a way that left no room for negotiation. "Every border pack he threatened will be brought fully under Draven protection. Every agent he has planted within my fortress will be found and removed, however long it takes. And if he ever again attempts to use an innocent person as leverage against me, he will learn exactly how far I am willing to go to protect what belongs to me, what I love more than anything I have ever fought to defend." Felix's guards, sensing the shifting balance of the confrontation and the overwhelming force Kane had brought to bear, began lowering their weapons one by one, unwilling to sacrifice themselves for a cause that had clearly already failed, the outpost defenses crumbling as quickly as Felix's own composure. Felix himself, recognizing the position he was in, raised his hands slowly, in a gesture of surrender, though the calculation still visible behind his eyes suggested this defeat was far from the end of Cross's larger ambitions against the Northern Territory. "This is not over," Felix said, even as Owen moved forward to restrain him, securing his hands with a rope that Elena recognized, with grim satisfaction, as similar to the one that had once bound her own wrists during her captivity. "No," Kane agreed, his voice hard and certain. "But your part in it is finished." He turned back to Elena, the fierce, protective intensity in his expression softening into something gentler as their eyes met, the storm of battle-focused adrenaline finally beginning to ease now that the immediate danger had passed. "Let us go home," he said softly. The journey back to the fortress felt different from every journey Elena had taken before, lighter somehow despite the exhaustion and lingering fear from her ordeal, the landscape rolling past them carrying none of the dread that had accompanied her first journey north, in chains so many weeks before. She rode beside Kane for most of the way, their hands finding each other whenever the terrain allowed, the silence between them comfortable rather than uncertain, filled with everything they had both nearly lost and everything they had chosen, in the end, to fight for instead. "I meant what I said back there," Kane told her, as the fortress finally came into view on the horizon, its dark towers catching the last light of the setting sun, transformed now in Elena's eyes from a symbol of fear into something she recognized, with a rush of feeling too large to fully name, as home. You belong here now, not as collateral, but as something far more important. If you will have me, fully and completely, I intend to make certain the entire territory understands exactly what you mean to me, before this court, and before every neighboring territory that might otherwise doubt the strength of what we have built together. Elena felt tears prick at her eyes again, though this time they carried nothing but happiness, deep and steady, and entirely without fear. I'll have you, she said softly. I think I decided that a long time ago, somewhere between the Great Hall and the library, though I was too frightened to fully admit it, even to myself, until everything we've just been through made pretending otherwise impossible. Kane brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, the same gesture he had offered her once before, in a moment of quiet vulnerability, though now it carried none of the fear that had accompanied it then, only certainty, and gratitude, and a love that had survived its greatest test and emerged, somehow, stronger for having endured it. Then let us go home, he said again, and begin whatever comes next, together, for as long as we both shall live. News of the confrontation at the eastern outpost spread through the Draven territory within days, carried by soldiers who had witnessed their king's fierce, unwavering determination to bring his collateral prisoner home safely. And by the time Elena and Kane returned to the fortress, the story had already transformed into something the entire court was eager to understand more fully. Whispers followed them through the corridors, no longer whispers of fear or suspicion, but of genuine admiration for the woman who had, however unexpectedly, found her way past the careful defenses of a king everyone had believed incapable of caring for anyone that deeply again, and for the resourcefulness she had shown even in captivity, weakening her captors from within before rescue ever arrived. Kane wasted no time addressing the situation directly. Within a week of their return, once Elena had rested enough to fully recover from the ordeal, and the fortress's immediate security concerns had been thoroughly addressed, he called a formal gathering of the court, the same great hall where Elena had first stood in chains, presented as nothing more than collateral against her father's unpaid debt. This time, she stood beside him rather than before him, dressed not in the dusty travel clothes of a prisoner, but in garments befitting the position everyone in the hall already understood she was about to formally claim, and the difference in her posture, in the way the court regarded her, was impossible to miss. Many of you have heard by now some version of what happened at the eastern outpost, Kane began, his voice carrying easily through the silent hall, every eye fixed on him with rapt attention. I want to address it directly, so there is no confusion about what it means for this territory going forward. He turned to look at Elena, something warm and unguarded in his expression that the court had never before witnessed from their king, a softness that transformed his usually stern features into something the older members of the court, who remembered him before Ilsa's death, recognized, with quiet, hopeful surprise. Elena Voss came to this fortress as collateral against a debt her father's territory owed. That debt is now forgiven in full, not as an act of mercy, but as an acknowledgement of everything she has done to protect this territory from a threat that endangered every pack within our borders, from the smallest, struggling homestead to the walls of this very fortress. A murmur moved through the hall, though this time it carried curiosity and approval, rather than the fearful silence Elena remembered from her first day standing in this very spot. More than that, Kane continued, I intend to formally claim Elena as my mate, if she will have me, and I ask this court to recognize her, not as a prisoner who once stood in these chains, but as the future queen of this territory, a woman whose courage and clarity of mind have already shaped the defense of every pack under our protection. Elena felt her heart swell with an emotion too large to fully contain, and when Kane turned to her, extending his hand in a gesture that asked, rather than demanded, her answer, she did not hesitate. I will, she said, loud enough for the entire hall to hear, her voice carrying none of the fear that had once made her chains feel unbearably heavy, and the answering roar of approval that rose from the assembled court, wolves and humans alike, filled the space that had once been so cold and silent, with a warmth Elena had never expected to witness within these walls. Her family arrived at the fortress 2 weeks later, summoned by Kane himself for the bonding ceremony he had insisted on preparing properly. wanting nothing rushed or incomplete for a moment he considered among the most important of his life. Elena's reunion with her father brought tears to eyes that had remained carefully guarded through every difficult moment of her captivity, and every anxious letter exchanged across 200 miles of contested borderland. Gerald Voss studied the daughter who had once left home in chains, now standing confidently beside the most powerful ruler in the Northern Territories, and found himself overwhelmed by a pride and relief too large for words. "I never imagined this," he admitted quietly, embracing her tightly, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. "When I sent you here, I thought I was condemning you to years of hardship, simply to protect the rest of our family. I never imagined you would find something like this, something so much larger than either of us could have hoped for." "Neither did I," Elena said, laughing through her own tears, holding on to her father, as though she could make up, in a single embrace, for every day of separation and worry they had both endured. "But I'm glad I did. I'm glad you sent me, even though I know how much it cost you to make that choice." Her mother, whose health had improved steadily in the months since Elena's departure, thanks in part to resources the Draven territory had quietly provided once the true circumstances of the debt became clear, embraced her next, unable to speak through her own tears, simply holding her daughter close for a long, wordless moment that said everything words could not have captured. Her brothers, grown taller and more confident in the months since she had last seen them, crowded around with excited questions about the fortress, about the king, about everything Elena had experienced since leaving home, and she found herself laughing more freely than she had in weeks, surrounded finally by everyone she loved most in the world. The bonding ceremony itself took place beneath the open sky, in the same training grounds where Cain had first admitted his growing feelings for her, transformed now with careful decoration into something warm and celebratory, rather than a space of discipline and drills. Flowers Elena did not recognize, brought from territories throughout the north, lined the pathways, and long tables laden with food filled the air with the rich smells of a feast prepared to honor an occasion the entire territory had come to celebrate together. Representatives from border pacts throughout the territory attended, including families whose safety had been secured by the additional protections Cain had ordered after uncovering Cross's network. Families who understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, exactly how much they owed to the Collateral prisoner who had become their queen. Clara stood among the guests, dressed in finery Elena had helped arrange for her, tears streaming freely down her face as she watched her friend prepare for the ceremony. "I told you to be careful," she said, laughing through her tears, as she embraced Elena one final time before the ceremony began. "I don't think either of us understood, back then, what we were actually being careful about." "Neither did I," Elena admitted, squeezing her friend's hands warmly. "Thank you, Clara, for every warning and every bit of support, even when you thought I was making a terrible mistake." "You weren't," Clara said simply. "You were braver than I understood at the time. I'm proud to have been there for it." Owen, standing at attention near the ceremony grounds in his formal uniform, offered Elena a rare, genuine smile as she passed him on her way toward where Cain waited. "The king has not smiled this freely in years," he said quietly. "You have given this entire court something we did not realize we had lost until you arrived to bring it back." Edmund, too, approached her briefly before the ceremony began. His usual careful formality softened into something warmer. "I have served this territory through difficult years," he said. "I did not expect, when Owen first brought you before the king in chains, that I would one day stand here watching you prepare to become our queen. It is, without question, the finest outcome I could have imagined for this court." As the ceremony reached its final moments, Cain took Elena's hands in his expression carrying none of the careful, controlled distance that had once defined him in the eyes of his entire court. "I spent years believing that mercy and love were weaknesses I could not afford," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, steady, despite the emotion evident beneath his words. "Elena Voss taught me otherwise. She taught me that strength and tenderness are not opposites, that a king can protect his people without losing the parts of himself that make him capable of love. I am a better ruler, and a better man, because of her, and I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the trust she placed in me, from that very first day when she refused to let me dismiss her as nothing more than collateral." Elena felt tears streaming freely down her face now, unable and unwilling to hold them back. "I came here afraid," she said, when it was her turn to speak, her voice carrying steadily despite the emotion coursing through her. "Afraid for my family. Afraid of a man everyone told me was merciless and cold. I found instead someone who was simply guarding a heart that had already been hurt too deeply. Someone who chose, despite that fear, to let me in anyway, and to fight for me when it mattered most. That courage means more to me than any title or ceremony ever could, and I intend to spend the rest of my life standing beside him, whatever challenges this territory still has to face." As the sun set over the northern territory, casting warm golden light across the fortress that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming, to a frightened young woman brought there in chains, Cain and Elena stood together before their assembled court, bound now not by debt or obligation, but by a choice they had both made freely, despite every fear that had once told them it was impossible. The celebration that followed stretched long into the evening, music and laughter filling grounds that had once known only the disciplined silence of morning drills, and Elena moved through the gathering surrounded by everyone she loved, her family, her friend, the court that had slowly, over these past months, come to accept and then embrace her as one of their own. She found Cain near the edge of the celebration at one point, watching the festivities with an expression of quiet contentment she had never seen from him before, and slipped her hand into his, content simply to stand beside him in comfortable silence. Damien Cross's ambitions did not disappear entirely in the weeks and months that followed. 2 weeks after the bonding ceremony, Cain's scouts finally located Nikolai, the scarred traitor whose visit to Elena's home territory had first set the entire conspiracy in motion, hiding in a small settlement along the eastern border, under a name that fooled no one who had studied Edmund's careful notes closely enough. Nikolai was captured without violence, brought before Cain in a private chamber rather than the Great Hall, and after several hours of careful, patient questioning, provided information that confirmed the full extent of Cross's campaign against the Northern Territories, a slow, patient strategy of debts manufactured, alliances quietly undermined, and vulnerable pacts identified for isolation, one careless season at a time. He intended to do this for years, Cain told Elena that evening, laying out everything Nikolai had confessed across the desk in the West Study. Not a single decisive war, but a slow unraveling, patient enough that no single action would ever seem significant enough to provoke a unified response until it was too late to reverse. "And now?" Elena asked. "What happens to his plan now that we understand it fully?" "Now we unravel it in return," Cain said. "Every border pack he identified as vulnerable, we strengthen. Every alliance he attempted to fracture, we reinforce. Patience was his greatest weapon. It can become ours instead." Over the following months, that patient strategy proved its worth. Border packs that had once struggled alone against the pressure of unpayable debts and quiet intimidation found themselves woven more securely into the protection of the Draven territory, their concerns heard directly by a queen who understood, from lived experience, exactly what it meant to watch a family struggle against forces too large to fight alone. Elena traveled often in those early months, visiting territory after territory alongside Cain, learning names and faces, and the particular hardships of each small pack scattered along the contested northern border, and slowly, patiently, the network Damien Cross had spent years building began to crumble in return. Agent by agent, informant by informant, until messages from border patrols confirmed what everyone in the fortress had begun to hope was true. Cross's reach into Draven territory had been reduced to almost nothing, his ambitions contained, for now, behind his own borders. Damien himself sent no further word, no further threats, no acknowledgement of the campaign's quiet collapse, though Felix, captured during the confrontation at the eastern outpost, and eventually exchanged as part of a careful diplomatic arrangement between the territories, was said to have warned his alpha, upon his return, that the Draven king and his queen together posed a far greater obstacle than either had anticipated when the campaign against the border packs first began. Gareth, whose fear-driven betrayal had led directly to Elena's capture, was not executed, despite the severity of what his actions had nearly cost the entire territory. Cain, in a decision that surprised many among his officers, and delighted none more than Elena herself, chose instead to arrange for Gareth's mother and sisters to be quietly relocated out of Cross's reach and resettled within Draven territory, removing the leverage that had driven the young guard's betrayal in the first place, while Gareth himself was stripped of his position and assigned to years of careful, closely supervised labor, rebuilding the very border defenses his actions had once compromised. "Mercy again," Aldrich observed, watching the arrangement unfold with an expression that had long since shifted from skepticism into genuine respect for the king's evolving judgment. "I would not have predicted it, once. Mercy, applied wisely, is not the weakness I once believed it to be," Kane said simply. "Elena taught me that. I intend to keep learning the lesson for the rest of my life." The following spring, nearly a full year after chains first bound Elena's wrists in the cold, silent hall where this entire story began, she stood once more in that same great hall, though everything about the moment felt entirely transformed from what it had once been. The hall itself had changed subtly under her influence, warmer tapestries lining walls that had once felt bare and forbidding, the black stone floor no longer echoing with silence but filled, on this particular morning, with the sound of representatives from every northern territory gathered to witness the formal signing of a new alliance, one Elena herself had helped negotiate over months of careful, patient diplomacy, binding every border pact more securely to the protection and prosperity of the territory she now called home. Her father stood among the witnesses that day, no longer the anxious beta who had once sent his daughter north to settle a debt he feared might cost her everything, but a respected voice among the northern pacts. His own territory strengthened and thriving under the alliance his daughter's courage had helped build. He caught her eye across the crowded hall as the final signatures were affixed to the treaty, and the pride evident in his expression needed no words to carry its full weight. That evening, as the celebrations following the treaty signing wound down and the fortress settled once more into quiet, Kane found Elena on the rooftop terrace, where he had once confessed, with such difficulty, the weight of a grief he had carried alone for years. She stood at the railing, watching the same sweeping view that had first taken her breath away, on a night that now felt both distant and impossibly close, and he came to stand beside her, wrapping an arm gently around her shoulders. "A year ago tonight," he said quietly, "you stood in the great hall in chains, and I told myself you meant nothing beyond the debt you represented. You were a terrible liar, even then," Elena said, laughing softly, leaning into him. "I saw it in your eyes, that very first day. Whatever you told yourself, some part of you already knew." "Perhaps," Kane admitted, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "I am simply grateful, every day since, that you refused to let me believe the lie for long." They stood together in comfortable silence as the stars emerged slowly across the clear spring sky. Two people who had built, out of collateral and captivity, and a debt that had once threatened to define everything about her presence within these walls. Something far more lasting than either of them could have imagined, on that first cold day, when the fortress gates closed behind her. But the northern territories would face those challenges together now, a king who had relearned how to feel, and a queen who had never stopped believing that even the most guarded hearts could be reached with patience, honesty, and courage. The fortress that had once been known only for its ruler's cold reputation slowly became known for something else entirely across the northern territories, a partnership between two people who had turned collateral and captivity into the foundation of something neither of them had ever expected to find, a love strong enough to soften even the most merciless of kings, and strong enough, in the months and years that followed, to guide an entire territory safely through whatever storms still waited on the horizon. And in the quiet moments after the ceremony, when the celebrations had finally settled, and the fortress grew peaceful beneath the stars, Kane held Elena close and whispered the simple truth that would define the rest of their lives together. "You did not just break through my walls," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that had once seemed impossible for a man everyone called Merciless. "You gave me a reason to want them gone, and you gave this entire territory a king worth following, not out of fear, but out of trust freely given. Whatever comes next, I intend to spend every remaining day of my life proving that trust was not misplaced." Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath the quiet night sky, and felt, for the first time since chains first bound her wrists in a cold, silent hall so many months before, that she had finally, truly come home.